She was the original royal rebel. Beautiful, brilliant, and born just close enough to power to be destroyed by it. For decades, Princess Margaret lived like a myth, the tiaras, the affairs, the cigarettes in gold holders. But behind the palace walls, the fantasy rotted. She was forced to give up the man she loved for duty. Later, she married a photographer, made him an earl, and watched their marriage unravel in silence, in betrayal, in public humiliation. The press that once adored her turned cruel. They called her a parasite, a hedonist, an unnecessary expense. Her name became a punchline, and still, she dazzled. She lit up every room with wit, presence, and impossible style. Her fights with Judy Garland and Elizabeth Taylor became legend. Her trip to Italy inspired Roman holiday. Her hair, her eyeliner, her attitude, copied by millions. But beneath it all, she was lonely, the outsider, the spare, the one who never quite fit. And when she finally found love with a man 17 years younger, the press mocked her. Tabloid photographers hid in bushes. The Queen called it my sister's gutter snipe life. But Margaret was never just a scandal. She was a gifted pianist, a brilliant designer, a tireless advocate for the causes she believed in. She survived betrayals that would have broken anyone else, and she kept going, in her own way, on her own terms. This is not a fairy tale. It's a story of beauty, fury, betrayal, and survival, beneath the tiaras, behind the palace doors. This is the full story of Princess Margaret, the love, the rage, the downfall, and the silence. And if you're drawn to stories like this, stories that go deeper than the headlines, that reveal the brilliance, heartbreak, and defiance of women history tried to tame, then you belong here. This channel is dedicated to the unforgettable, to truth over fairy tales, to the women who refuse to disappear. And now, let's dive into the full story of Princess Margaret. She was born in a castle that breathed legends. Glamours, a red stone fortress crouched deep in Angus, wasn't a backdrop. It was a myth in stone. Immortalized by Shakespeare and Macbeth, ghosts were said to pace its halls. There were whispers of the monster of Glamours, of sealed rooms filled with skulls, of doors that opened into shadows rather than hallways. It was here, in this house of murmurings, that the Duchess of York chose to give birth, just as she had been born there herself. And on the night of August 21st, 1930, as a violent thunderstorm split the sky above Scotland, a child arrived in the tapestry room. The winds hurled themselves at the castle's ancient glass, but inside all was still. A cradle waited, a midwife breathed steadily, and beneath centuries of stone, a duchess held her second daughter to her chest. Outside, lightning. Inside, silence. Royal births are never private. Not then, not now, and certainly not in 1930, when a single baby could reorder the line of succession like pieces on a chessboard. It was a foregone conclusion that the Duchess's second child would be a boy who would outrank Elizabeth and might one day wear the crown. So the government sent a witness, not a doctor, not a midwife, the Home Secretary. A relic from the age of warming pan scandals and whispered illegitimacies, the law still required a cabinet minister to personally verify each royal birth, to ensure the child was real, the mother was real, and no foreign infant had been slipped beneath the bedsheets. For 12 days, she had no name. Not because she was forgotten. Royal children are never forgotten, but because names in this family were not gifts. They were negotiations. Suggestions passed through corridors and cables, weighed for lineage, tone, and protocol. The Duchess wanted Anne Margaret. The King did not. A new list was drawn, softened, rewritten. And finally, the Duchess sent her reply. Margaret Rose. The name Margaret was chosen because it carried Scotland in its bones, the queens, the saints, the history that ran deeper than Glamour's old stone walls. It honored St. Margaret of Scotland, the medieval queen still venerated for her kindness. It echoed Margaret Tudor, the English princess whose marriage once bound two kingdoms. Rose was chosen for family, for Lady Rose Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess's gentle, steadfast sister, whose warmth had shaped the Bowes-Lyon household long before royalty entered their lives. Naming the baby after her was an act of affection, loyalty, and gratitude. Together the names formed a bridge, Margaret for Scotland, Rose for England. a Scottish spark crowned with an English flower. And so, from her first breath, the little princess carried both nations in her name. Even the registration carried its own shadow. Margaret's birth was set to be recorded as entry 13 in the village log. The Duke hesitated, waited a day, returned. She became entry 14, not by fate, but by the small superstition of a man who'd lived too long inside a palace of omens. Her christening followed on the 30th of October in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace, a room of lace, candles, and imperial ghosts that would be destroyed a decade later by the Germans. She wore the Honiton robe once sewn for Queen Victoria's eldest child, silk older than much of the empire it represented. She was lowered over the lily-shaped font filled with water from the River Jordan, while the Archbishop of Canterbury murmured the words that would fold her into a dynasty. Her godparents formed a constellation of power. Prince George, who stood in for David, who could not make it, a future Queen of Denmark by proxy. Princess Victoria, Lady Rosemary Lucen Gore, who was David's first love and the woman who could have perhaps stopped the later abdication crisis, had Queen Mary not forbade the match. And David Bowes Lyon. Ceremonies unfolded not like traditions, but like dance. At the top of this precision stood Queen Mary, stiff-backed, unmoved, immaculate. Duty was her doctrine, emotion her enemy. The family's inner life was measured not in affection, but in composure, the quiet endurance demanded of royalty. And into this machine of lace and steel came Margaret Rose, 6 pounds, 11 ounces swaddled in history. Before she could lift her head, the shape of her life was already closing in. Stone. Silence. Expectations written before she could read. Elizabeth would grow into this world with quiet purpose. Margaret would grow against it. No one saw it then. Not in the storm-lit chamber. Not in the christening robe of borrowed silk, but the truth had already begun to stir. A second daughter, born into the oldest order on earth, and destined to test the weight of every rule that held it together. Before Margaret took her first breath, her father had already spent a lifetime learning how not to show pain. Prince Albert, known to family as Bertie, had grown up beneath the weight of his father's silence. George V didn't believe in affection, he believed in obedience. Discipline, the shaping of sons like ships, all pressure and polish, no softness allowed. Bertie was raised by nurses, corrected by tutors, and comforted by no one. Splints were strapped to his legs to straighten his walk. His left hand was forced into right-handedness until the words jammed in his mouth. His stomach was damaged by a careless nanny. His voice betrayed him in public. And when it did, he learned to speak less. Even as a grown man, you could see it. The tight jaw before he spoke, the slight tremble in the breath he caught, the stillness that wasn't calm, it was bracing. They called him shy. What they never saw was how much courage it took for him simply to stay in a room. And one day, he would stand in that room holding his second daughter. Not with ease, but with a gentleness that whispered something had been healed. Where Bertie had been hollowed out by his childhood, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon had been filled to the brim. She grew up between Glamour's, St. Paul's Waldenbury, and a townhouse in London. But the place didn't shape her. People did. A warm, lively mother. A gentle, present father. Siblings who taught her how to live in a room full of noise and never lose her balance. Nothing in her upbringing prepared her for royalty, but everything in it prepared her for him. She didn't ration her smiles, she gave them freely. She didn't tolerate moods, she softened them. She didn't enter a room to be watched, she entered it to make others feel seen. She carried her warmth like other people carry a lamp, not with grandeur, but with light that reached everyone nearby. So when she said yes to Bertie, after refusing him twice, she wasn't choosing a title. She was choosing a man who needed her to stay, and a life she knew would need both of her hands to keep it steady. While the Prince of Wales lit up motorcars and nightclubs, Bertie and Elizabeth chose card games, country weekends, and conversations with familiar voices. Laughter around a low fire. By the time Elizabeth was born in 1926, they had made a sanctuary, a real one. Not in the palaces, but in the daily rituals, tiny socks folded, doors left open for wandering children, the sound of Bertie's voice softening around his daughter. The first thing Margaret knew was the sound of laughter at breakfast, a father who flinched less than he used to, a mother whose presence lit the room, and a house that had already learned how to love without asking permission. She grew up in 2 houses, and neither one was hers. One was made of marble and myth, the other of roses and rot. At 145 Piccadilly, elephant tusks curved over the door like a warning. Oil portraits stared down from ceilings. A black marble pageboy stood by the stairs, unmoving, unblinking. It wasn't a home, it was a museum of empire. The top, beneath a glass dome, light poured into the nursery. There, the world softened. And from her window, Margaret and Elizabeth could watch the glowing windows of St. George's Hospital across the street. It looked like other people's lives were happening in squares of light, she said once. Even as a child, she seemed to know. She wasn't in the light. She was watching it. The second house was different. At Royal Lodge, the roof sagged. The paint peeled. The plumbing rattled. But her parents saw something beautiful in the decay. They painted the walls blush pink. They planted rhododendrons. They filled it with noise. Her mother called it strawberries and cream. And for Margaret, it was the only place that ever felt like home. Her father, Prince Albert, had sworn that his daughters would never know what he had known. No cold rooms, no silence, no fear. Come what might, he said, they should look back on their childhood as a golden age. And for 6 years, before the abdication cracked the monarchy in two, each morning began with shrieks and sheets flying. Margaret and Elizabeth launching themselves into their parents' bed. Pillow fights, laughter, bathwater on the floor, and every night the stairwell rang with the same words. Good night, Mummy. Good night, Papa. It looked like freedom. But even golden nurseries have bars. Margaret was not raised by her parents alone. There were nurses, nannies, governesses. There were rules, rituals, a mold waiting to be filled. And there were 2 little girls dressed alike, tartan skirts, lace socks, matching coats, but raised to play very different parts. Elizabeth had Bobo, red-haired, calm, eternally devoted. She would follow Elizabeth for the rest of her life, dresser, companion, shadow. Margaret had Alla, older, formal, possessive. She kept Margaret in bows and prams long after she could walk. Margaret's first memory was falling out of her pram. I just wanted to be seen, she said. Margaret kicked, and wriggled and charmed, and slipped out of every ribbon. From the start, Margaret didn't follow rules. She bent them, broke them, and laughed while doing it. Even Crofty, their Scottish governess, saw it. She arrived in 1932, expecting to stay a year. She stayed 15. She saw what others missed. The baby everyone loves at sight, she wrote, but clever enough to know it. The 2 little princesses captivated the public, who at the time could see them only on newsreels, or if lucky while traveling on one of the early double-decker buses, seeing them play in the garden. Margaret's first public appearance came in 1934 at the wedding of George and Marina. She sat in the audience in a silk dress, beaming. Elizabeth, already poised, served as bridesmaid. Margaret sparkled and stole the crowd. The public saw perfect harmony in the romance of the 2 princesses. Margaret and Elizabeth shared toys, shared clothes, shared a playhouse with working plumbing and rock-hard scones. But the bond was never equal. They fought, they slapped. Elizabeth snapped hat elastics. Margaret bit her. Margaret always wants what I want, Elizabeth once said. Margaret was a natural performer. She mimicked. At 9 months, she hummed the waltz from The Merry Widow. By 2, she could hum any tune she had heard perfectly. She turned every punishment into a scene. She invented an imaginary aristocrat, Cousin Halifax, and blamed him for everything. Why haven't you done your lessons? I was busy with Cousin Halifax. She made up entire kingdoms, green horses, talking cats, pantomimes and dreamscapes she recited like gospel. She had a piano teacher, a singing coach, and a voice. But her sharpest gift wasn't music. It was comedy. She mocked courtiers with terrifying precision. She made her mother wince and laugh. Even her misbehavior had timing. Windy water, she called soda. It crackles my nose. No one could control her, not really. So they laughed instead. Crofty saw it all. She took Margaret out of the pram, stripped off the frills, let her run, let her shout. Rumors had begun to circulate in public, quiet, absurd, and cruel, that Margaret was deaf and dumb. Allah never corrected them. Crofty laughed at them. Then one day, as her sister raced ahead of her, Margaret shouted, "Wait for me, Lilibet," and the public heard her. She had a voice now, a presence, a rhythm all her own. Sadly, one day the woman who had meant so much to her would betray her. In 1950, Crofty published The Little Princesses, a sugary memoir that showed Margaret as spoiled, dramatic, jealous. In many ways, this colored the public's perception of Margaret that she was never able to outgrow. The Queen Mother was livid. Elizabeth, now heir, felt exposed. And Margaret was humiliated. And the woman who had helped shape Margaret's formative years, the person who was in many ways closest to her, was cut off. Her name was scrubbed from official records. Even years later, Margaret had a phrase for betrayal, doing a Crofty, meaning, you don't come back from this. But the book wasn't entirely wrong. Crofty had seen the real child, not just the sparkle, but the shadow. She saw a girl who didn't fit, not into the throne room, not into the nursery. A girl taught how to shine, but never how to serve. She saw a girl underestimated, indulged, not taken seriously. A girl who knew from the start that if she couldn't have the throne, she would take the spotlight. And she often did. When she was 5, Margaret dressed for a costume party. An angel costume, all tulle and innocence. Her mother looked her over and said gently, "You don't look very angelic, Margaret." The child didn't blink. "That's all right," she said. "I'll be a holy terror." She wasn't bluffing. The golden age was ending. The throne was moving. And Margaret, clever, funny, theatrical Margaret, was about to learn that charm doesn't outrank protocol. Her grandfather, George V, ruled as if he had been carved from iron. A man who believed discipline built dynasties and softness ruined them. He barked orders like a naval officer facing mutiny. His beard was bristly. His spelling was poor. His love, if it existed, was silent. "For God's sake," he once snapped to the governess, "teach them to write a decent hand. Not to think well, to present well." The world saw him as a stately grandfather, the gray-haired monarch with children at his knees. Margaret remembered something else. "He was the most objectionable old man," she said later. "We were much too frightened of him to call him anything but grandpapa." Elizabeth fared better. Even at 3, she understood how to charm a king. One Christmas, she heard the carol while shepherds watched their flocks by night and turned to her grandfather with cheerful mischief. "That's you, grandpapa. You are old and very, very kind." He smiled. She lied. It worked. If George was stern, Queen Mary was stone. She ruled rooms with silence. Tiaras sat on her head like armor. She greeted her granddaughters with a kiss on the hand, 2 on the cheek, and not a flicker of emotion in her eyes. "Absolutely terrifying," Margaret said. "We always felt we were about to be hauled over the coals." Queen Mary didn't raise girls. She raised heirlooms. She demanded more history, more scripture, more dynastic genealogy. She believed children should know the weight of their bloodline and carry it, word for word, without complaint. The heir was David, but the world knew him as Edward, the Golden Prince, the man who had everything and gave it all away. He danced through ballrooms, drank with dukes, flirted with the press, carried on numerous scandalous affairs, and wore his crown like it was borrowed. To Margaret, he was something simpler. Uncle David. He gave her Winnie the Pooh books, played cards after tea, made her laugh. And then, quietly, he drifted away. He had fallen for a divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. Loud, glamorous, impossible. He brought her to court, flaunted her before cameras, and spoke of duty as if it were an outdated fashion. By 1934, the Yorks understood what was coming. The visits stopped. The silences lengthened. Uncle David still sent books, but the little girl who once perched on his knee would spend her life measured against him. Both beautiful, both dramatic, both accused of selfishness, frivolity, excess, both unwilling to surrender what they loved to what they were born into. And one day, like David, Margaret would face the same impossible choice, love or duty. Another uncle hovered at the edges of her childhood, George, Duke of Kent, who moved through the palace like a secret. He was beautiful, and he knew it. Black hair slicked like the Riviera, blue eyes that caught every light, a pianist's hands, a designer's eye. He didn't shoot grouse. He arranged flowers. He didn't ride horses. He went to the theater. He didn't drink port. He mixed cocktails. He loved music, cinema, decoration, men, women, everyone. He was arrested once in a notorious gay club, quietly released, escorted home. Even his older brother, Edward, had to intervene to pull him back from morphine. But for a time, it worked. For a time, the scandal faded. In 1934, George announced his engagement to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, all elegance and aristocracy. The match was spotless. The Windsors exhaled. Margaret would remember the Kents not with judgment, but admiration. They were beautiful people, she said later. If her father's family represented duty, the Kents represented something else: freedom, taste, grace, secrets. Had George lived longer, Margaret might have followed him into a life of velvet, vodka, and private risks. But in 1942, during the war, his plane went down, and another door closed. Margaret would spend the rest of her life searching for a window. On May 6th, King George celebrated his Silver Jubilee, 25 years on the throne. There were parades, processions, banners loud enough to drown the whispers. The king rode in a grand carriage with Queen Mary. Behind them came the Yorks, Bertie, Elizabeth, and two little girls in pink dresses, waving like dolls. A royal diarist wrote, "The baby princesses, much interested in the proceedings and waving." That's all they were, accessories to tradition, but the crowd adored them, and the palace noticed. Soon after came another wedding, another photo op. This time, Margaret and Elizabeth were bridesmaids for their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. Their dresses were too long. The king ordered them shortened. "I want to see their pretty little knees." The message was clear. This wasn't just monarchy, it was marketing. Photographs of Margaret and Elizabeth began to appear everywhere. Newspapers, shop windows, postcards. To a country bruised by depression, the royal family was stability. But the king was sick. The last Christmas of George V's reign was quiet. The palace was whispering. But the children, still children, wrote letters to Santa, wrapped Woolworth gifts in wrinkled paper, hung stockings on the mantle. On January 20th, 1936, the king died. The throne passed to Edward. The world began to shift. At Royal Lodge, the Duchess of York was recovering from pneumonia. The Duke had flown to Norfolk. Margaret and Elizabeth were home with Crawfie and Allah. They weren't told right away. The Duchess left a note. "Don't let all this depress them more than is absolutely necessary, Crawfie. They are so young." And they were. Elizabeth was 9, Margaret was 5. But something passed through the walls. Something adult, something final. Elizabeth brushed her toy horse and asked, "Ought we to play?" Margaret didn't understand. Not really. She only noticed that Allah kept bursting into tears. And then Margaret said the line that would echo through every obituary, "Grandpapa has gone to heaven," she told the room, "and I am sure that God is finding him very useful." She didn't yet understand what death meant, but she understood what absence felt like. A new king sat on the British throne, but upstairs at 145 Piccadilly, childhood carried on as if history hadn't shifted beneath their feet. The schoolroom bell still rang at 9. The wireless played the same cheerful songs. Elizabeth recited elocution exercises with solemn focus. Margaret built kingdoms from blocks, filled with imaginary courtiers and battles only she could explain. And then Uncle David, now king, began to visit. He had once filled their lives like sunlight, warm, charming, full of stories. He knelt to help with puzzles, promised card games after tea, treated them like they mattered. Now something in him had dimmed. Crawfie noticed first. He had been so youthful and gay, she wrote. Now he looked distraught, not listening, forgetting. A king who couldn't keep a promise to children. That was the first sign. The second came in whispers. "The lady is still there." They meant Wallis Simpson. They meant she hadn't left Fort Belvedere. They meant she sat beside him at meetings. Then came the dinner. The king wanted Wallis recognized, seated beside him at St. James's Palace, not as scandal, but as certainty. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted approval. He wanted his family to fold her into the picture. The Duchess of York gave him nothing. She arrived with perfect posture, said all the right things, and withheld everything that mattered. She did not warm, she did not bend, she did not bless the performance. Then Churchill, always watching, always stirring, leaned in gently. "My dear Duchess, what do you think of the marriage of King George IV and Mrs. Fitzherbert?" A blade, disguised as a question. The Duchess didn't blink. That, she said, setting down her fork, was a long time ago. The only time Margaret saw Wallace Simpson as a child began with excitement. Uncle David was coming to show off his new American station wagon, a novelty, a treat. Margaret pressed her nose to the glass. Elizabeth stood beside her, hands clasped. The car swept the drive. Then the door opened, and Wallace stepped out. Margaret stared, unblinking, curious, perceptive. Wallace bent with a brittle smile, the kind adults use to impress children without understanding them. During tea, she walked to the window of 145 Piccadilly, her voice clipped and casual, as if she had always belonged. "Wouldn't it be better," she said, gesturing toward the garden, "if a few trees were cut down?" No one answered. No one dared. It was the only time Margaret ever saw her as a child, the woman who brought the crown to its knees, and though no courtier recorded the visit, Margaret's memory never forgot. The image stayed, a stranger rearranging the world as if it were hers. Not long after, Margaret's first pony died. She met the loss with the brusque defiance of a child taught never to cry. "I suppose Jesus is riding him now," she said, "instead of that silly old donkey." One evening, her nanny Alla overheard her saying her prayers, a dramatic litany of requests, complaints, and careful bargains with heaven. "Darling," Alla murmured, "God may not be able to grant everything you ask." Margaret didn't blink. "That's all right," she said. "Grandpapa's up there now. He'll see to it." The girls bickered as children do, with passion and pageantry. Books were slammed. Toys became missiles. Lilibet, precise even in fury, slapped. Margaret bit. When forced to wear hats, they snapped each other's elastics with whispered war cries. But tantrums passed like clouds, and always, eventually, the giggles broke through. At swimming lessons, Margaret clung to the pool's edge, trembling with the drama of cold water. "You mustn't be a limpet," Lilibet scolded. 2 years later, Margaret would win her life-saving certificate, not because she enjoyed the water, but because she wanted to be worthy of it. They watched parties from the top of the staircase, foreheads pressed between balustrades, their eyes wide as music floated upward like mist. They waged pillow fights in silk sheets, read fairy tales by torchlight, and presided over their miniature Welsh cottage in the garden, a gift from the people. "We've got everything but a telephone," Margaret said proudly, as if it might arrive by morning. She was volcanic where her sister was glacial. When their father came home, Elizabeth curtsied. Margaret flung herself into his arms with the force of a storm, wrapping herself around his neck until he laughed. One was trained for the world, the other tilted it. Their mother, determined to raise princesses who could charm a nation, turned the drawing room into a stage. "Now I'm the archbishop," she'd say. "Now I'm Granny." And the girls, without hesitation, would bow, curtsy, smile, respond, lines memorized long before they understood the roles. But outside, history was darkening. By December 1936, crowds gathered daily outside Piccadilly. The whispers were no longer whispers. The papers no longer concealed it. One morning, their father stood before them in full admiral's uniform. He kissed them both, grave and gentle. "When I come home," he said, "I'll be king. You must curtsy." He turned to Margaret. "You too, darling, try not to topple over." That evening, the crowds outside roared. The girls curtsied, and the man now called George VI swept them into his arms, voice cracking, eyes wet, a monarch stunned by love. Later that night, Margaret turned to her sister. "Now that Papa is king," she asked quietly, "will you be queen someday?" "Yes," Elizabeth answered. "I suppose I will." Margaret thought for a moment. Then solemnly she said, "Poor you." 2 days later, guns saluted the king's birthday. Margaret was told they would be moving to Buckingham Palace. "You mean forever?" Elizabeth asked. As they packed, Margaret was told she must give half her toys to children in hospital. "It's quite impossible," she frowned. "Nothing is impossible," someone replied gently. Margaret looked up, unimpressed. "Have you ever tried putting toothpaste back in the tube?" Buckingham. The palace was a maze. Endless corridors, dim rooms, thick carpets that swallowed footsteps. Policemen saluted. Maids disappeared at the creak of stairs. Everything smelled faintly of polish and past lives. Margaret explored it like a storybook. She made a game of it. jumping from behind pillars with theatrical boos, making secretaries shriek and footmen drop silver trays. "What are we to do with her?" sighed Lilibet. The schoolroom was no easier. Outside, the guards changed daily with pageantry. Inside, Margaret struggled to sit still. At night, wind rattled the casements. The chimneys moaned. Sometimes Margaret couldn't sleep. Alla sat beside her, knitting in silence, waiting until her breathing slowed. In spring, the coronation approached. Margaret was told she wouldn't wear a train. "But if Lilibet has one, I must too," she insisted. "Why can't I?" The queen relented. Ivory lace over satin, gold trim, coronet on her head. Before the ceremony, their father gathered them both and spoke quietly about love, about duty, about how proud he was. They rode in the state coach beside Queen Mary. Margaret waved with the delight of someone unbothered by protocol. Later, when asked how she had behaved, Elizabeth smiled. "Wonderful. I only nudged her twice when she dropped her prayer book." But the difference had begun. They wore matching tartan coats and identical hats, but already one was heir, the other an afterthought. Elizabeth was taken to ceremonies. Margaret was left behind. The pageantry parted them like a velvet curtain, one stepping into destiny, the other fading into the wings, and Margaret grew lonely. "I just learned how to spell York," she told Cynthia Asquith. "Now I am just Margaret, all alone." Every king she had known vanished in a whisper. Her grandfather had faded into marble silence. Uncle David abdicated, a golden ghost exiled by love. Now her own father had been consumed, not by passion, but by protocol. Each morning he vanished into rooms with red boxes and heavy doors. He returned late, tight-jawed, hollowed, a stranger in a crown. In those bewildering months, George VI was drowning. The rituals exhausted him, the speeches terrified him. The sheer performance of power stripped him bare. "I've never even seen a state paper," he confessed to Mountbatten. Beside him stood a queen no one quite believed in. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had none of Queen Mary's iron majesty. To Edward VIII's glittering circle, she was that common little woman. Even those who admired her called her, half kindly, half condescendingly, the little Duchess. But within the palace, the sisters remained close. In public, they were dressed as twins. In private, they lived inside a fairy tale, half fantasy, half fortress. Margaret invented companions. Cousin Halifax did everything wrong. If the dog slipped its lead, it was his fault. If homework was lost, he had hidden it. If Margaret was cross, Cousin Halifax had been cruel. Some laughed, others didn't. Crawfie, their governess, worried she was too high-strung. To soften the solitude, a brownie pack was formed from palace servants' children. Elizabeth had her girl guides. Margaret had her pirates. She devoured novels about shipwrecks and treasure maps, collected postcards, and memorized every grown-up's name. The royal couple tried to give the girls ordinary days in an extraordinary life. Trips to the zoo, boat rides, underground rides, science museums, pantomimes. In the royal ballroom, they watched Snow White, velvet seats and flickering shadows. Her final pre-war pantomime, Little Red Riding Hood, played the same week Chamberlain promised, "Peace in our time." A television arrived. The king couldn't work it. Margaret could, or pretended she could, and mimicked him with merciless charm. From behind a gallery screen, the sisters watched the debutantes parade in ostrich plumes and satin gloves. "One day we'll be down there," said Elizabeth, "sharing the fun." Margaret nodded. "I want to dress like Aunt Marina." But the storm was already near. That summer, they visited Dartmouth Naval College, the day Elizabeth met Prince Philip. But Margaret had met him first, 5 weeks earlier, over tea. He teased her. She giggled. They laughed together. Then the wireless crackled. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain was at war. At Burke Hall, the girls sat beside the radio. The voice of the flowers of spring, tra-la-la, was cut short. At 6 p.m., their father's voice came through the static, brittle, brave. "We must stand firm, stand united." Margaret turned to her sister. "Who is this Hitler spoiling everything?" It was not naivete. It was the clearest question anyone had asked. At Burke Hall, Crawfie was under orders. Keep the routine. Lessons continued. So did the sewing circles, the Charlie Chaplin reels, the BBC dramas, and the damp Highland walks that left the girls chilled and red-cheeked. But even as the radio sang and the fire crackled, Margaret began to feel something shift. The silence between visits. The calls that came once a week, always too short. The ache of absence that even a governess couldn't patch. She was almost 11 now, and restless. Elizabeth was allowed to stay up late. Margaret was not. And only when Crawfie marched her toward the stairs with a firm, "To bed now, Margaret," would the child obey, huffing, theatrical, defeated. It was still the phony war. The hush before the storm. Then came the move. The Prime Minister offered to evacuate the princesses to Canada. The Queen replied, "They cannot go without me, and I will not leave the King." So Windsor became their fortress, cold, cavernous, and creaking with wartime dread. Carpets were rolled up to prevent fires. Wardens patrolled the halls. At night, the air raid sirens shrieked through stone, and the girls scrambled to the cellars in their nightgowns, beetles scattering underfoot. Margaret turned it into theater. 30 officers often came to lunch. She held court, impersonating their accents, inventing rules, performing small scandals of court life in miniature. She planted a garden, rolled bandages, knitted scarves for the troops, and collected tinfoil with unbothered pride. When Elizabeth proposed a broadcast to children affected by the war, Margaret beamed, "Oh yes, we must!" Then came the disappointment. She was left out. Only after days of pleading did her parents allow a single line at the very end. "Good night, and good luck to you all." But her voice was steady. Windsor gave Margaret something she'd never had, an audience. That Christmas, the sisters staged a nativity in the Waterloo Chamber. Elizabeth was one of the kings. Margaret, radiant, poised, unnervingly still, played the child. She sang "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild," and the king, a man not known for softness, wept quietly. "I cried through most of it," he wrote in his diary. Soon the pantomimes became tradition. Cinderella, 1941, Sleeping Beauty, 1942, Aladdin, 1943, Old Mother Red Riding Boots, 1944. Margaret cast herself as principal girl. Elizabeth, ever dutiful, played principal boy. Margaret designed the costumes, painted the sets, arranged rehearsals, and helped raise nearly £1,000 for the Queen's Wool Fund. Some said she could have been a designer in another life, but that path was never open to her. By the third year, the anxiety crept in. She began to hesitate before performances. Stage fright wrapped its fingers around her throat. Migraines struck with frightening force, piercing, nauseating, impossible to ignore. They would haunt her for life. A family friend observed, "She wasn't quite as merry this year. She takes herself so seriously." And yet, when the curtain rose, Margaret glowed. Her voice carried, her timing landed. She didn't perform, she became. As the war rolled on, so did the visitors. American airmen passed through Windsor like folk heroes. Margaret adored them. She'd press her hand into theirs, eyes wide, asking for stories. She'd play them piano pieces, sing songs, memorize their names. But something deeper had shifted. Elizabeth was 16. She'd been named Colonel of the Grenadier Guards. She was registering for voluntary service. Margaret, once again, was too young. When she was barred from attending an officer's dance, she burst into tears. "I was born too late." Elizabeth now had a private suite. Margaret still shared a room with Allah. She was offered Lilibet's hand-me-downs. She refused. "These are not for me." But when Aunt Marina gifted her a fan once owned by Marie Antoinette, she accepted without hesitation, delighted, transported. At family dinners, even as bombs fell in the distance, she made them all laugh. Her mimicry was razor-sharp. Nobody was spared, not even Elizabeth. But alone with her father, she quieted. The king worried she had no real friends her age. He rode with her when he could, played cards, let her win. He'd rest his hand on hers during long silences. One courtier's daughter put it bluntly. She was terribly spoiled by her father. She was his pet. We all found her amusing, but she kept everyone waiting while she finished her radio plays. In 1944, Elizabeth joined the ATS. Her courtship with Prince Philip had begun, and Margaret, now 14, finally stepped into the public eye. She accepted a donation on behalf of a Windsor school that bore her name. It was her first solo engagement, but the gap between them had widened. Elizabeth was now one of the counselors of state. Margaret was not. "Now I am floored," she said. "I will be put in my place." That same year, the future arrived, quietly. A tall, quiet man came to Windsor, a war hero, married, 2 sons. His name was Peter Townsend. He had a stutter like the king. The two grew close, father and son in a way. The king trusted him with thoughts he told no one else. Townsend later wrote that when he first met Margaret, he found her unremarkable, except for her eyes, dark blue like the sea in the tropics. One day, he would not forget her, and it would tear the family apart. Sometimes Margaret accompanied Elizabeth to airfields and barracks. Margaret would scan the papers searching for her photos only to find she had been cropped out. "I've been censored," she said, again. Elizabeth herself wrote to Fleet Street, "Please do not cut Princess Margaret out of the pictures unless unavoidable." Then the bombs stopped. The sirens died. The war was over. Margaret gathered her German textbooks, dropped them on the floor, and declared, "I'll never learn another word of Hitler's language." On May 6, 1945, they returned to Buckingham Palace. The crowds were back. The flags flew. 2 days later on VE Day, 2 girls in scarves and coats slipped into the street. No entourage, no cameras, just Margaret and Lilibet, and 2 officers in plain suits, walking into the heart of celebration. They danced, they shouted, they held hands with strangers. "It was absolutely wonderful," Margaret said. "I never had such a beautiful evening." The war was over. But Margaret's private battle, for place, for purpose, for something of her own, was just beginning. And the years that followed would drive the 2 princesses further apart. In 1945, Margaret turned 15, that knife-edged age when a girl begins to feel the world fray into halves, the life she is expected to live and the one she secretly longs for. Her sister, steadfast Elizabeth, tramped into the Highlands to stalk deer with their father, wrapped in the approved garments of duty and damp wool. Margaret refused to go. The kill repulsed her. The clothes were hideous. The performance wasn't hers. She was already cultivating a different self, vivid, dramatic, veined with irony and flair. She adored parlor games, the piano, and could mimic Ethel Merman with such gusto it made the footmen weep with laughter. Canasta thrilled her. Chopin moved her. Music became her spell. Singing, her escape. Her bedroom echoed with American show tunes. She was not the heir. She could afford to dream. Margaret spent long hours alone, tucked behind drawn curtains, reading novels and sketching imaginary lives. She began to notice herself, the curve of her wrist at the keys, the arch of her eyebrow when she delivered a line just so. She could feel the attention when she entered a room. She liked it. Older cousins whispered that she was spoiled. They meant it as criticism. She heard it as prophecy. Her first solo engagement came in 1946, opening a new play center for the Save the Children Fund. She wore a rose-colored coat and spoke in a voice that trembled only once. At court dances and theater nights, she was lively, observant, a girl who knew the lines and who, more and more, was beginning to write her own. At 16, she stood at the luminous edge between performance and reality, childhood and something else entirely. The royal tour of South Africa, orchestrated to renew imperial ties, became her private opera of sensation, travel, and flirtation. Years later, she would say simply, "I remember every minute of it." She had lived every second like a breathless song. In Cape Town, a crowd in white uniforms spelled welcome with their bodies. Margaret's eyes danced over the pageantry. There were inspections and speeches, but she found her own tempo within it. When she and Elizabeth spotted a group of lepers at a distance, Margaret insisted they go to them. Later, when the chairman of De Beers presented the princesses with diamonds, she arched a brow. "Where's mummies?" The press called it impish. It was something sharper. She rode the famed white train, the heaviest, most lavish ever run on South African rails, and declared it heaven. She pulled the whistle herself and laughed as it shrieked across the veldt. She visited ostrich farms and Zulu pageants, coaxed her mother into letting her tour a gold mine, and boarded a plane for the first time. Over Rhodesia's rainforests, she stood beside Elizabeth and marveled at the green chaos below. Along the Indian Ocean, they rode horses with the king's equerry, Group Captain Peter Townsend, who trotted beside them in crisp uniform, attentive, silent, always watching. If Margaret noticed him, It was not as a man, not yet. He was part of the scenery, polished, kind, capable. He made things happen and disappear. When speeches dragged, she rolled her eyes behind his back. When sermons bored her, she stood abruptly, only to be tugged down by her mother's gloved hand. In Victoria Falls, she pressed against the rails, letting the spray cool her cheeks. That night on the white train again, she wrote rhapsodies in her diary about the whistle, the clouds, the strange thrill of movement. But it was something else she was beginning to crave. Not novelty, intimacy. Elizabeth turned 21 on that tour, giving her famous speech from Cape Town. The weight of the crown sank deeper into her. For Margaret, the trip stirred a different hunger. For beauty, for attention, for risk. When the family returned to London, the air felt thinner, more formal, less alive. South African sunlight gave way to gray. Margaret, newly 17, wandered the halls of Buckingham Palace with a restlessness that no longer felt adolescent. Her sister's engagement to Philip, long whispered, had become fact. "Poor Lil," Margaret quipped once, half laughing, "nothing of your own. Not even your love affair." That summer, she passed her driving test on the wild roads of Balmoral. She helped Elizabeth with minor duties, but she was stepping into her own light now, naming ships, launching centers, delivering speeches. In October, she toured Northern Ireland. By November, she was named Colonel-in-Chief of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, a ceremonial title, but one she wore like armor. She had learned to walk with a certain elegance and danger, like a sword in a silk sheath. Elizabeth's wedding approached with the weight of a coronation. Margaret, luminous in white, served as chief bridesmaid. When the page boys buckled under the burden of the 15-foot train, it was Margaret who stepped forward, lifted the hem, and carried it herself. After the ceremony, she slipped away. Upstairs, alone, she wept. "I can't imagine life here without Lilibet," she whispered. For a moment, all the grandeur fell away. One sister had entered marriage, the other myth. "Never mind, Margaret," said Crofty. "You'll be next." But it wasn't next. It wasn't even near. Now Elizabeth was pregnant, drawing inward, into motherhood, into monarchy, and Margaret was stepping out. She took up patronages, visited orphanages and shipyards, opened schools and libraries. Her migraine still returned with cruel precision, but she rarely missed a duty. In Glasgow, she accepted the freedom of the city while barely able to stand, retreating only after the ceremony ended. That winter, American magazines dubbed her the blooming of Princess Margaret Rose. No longer cut out of the frame, now the frame was hers. 18 came in a rush of flashbulbs and fanfare. Margaret's portrait was everywhere. Alabaster skin, arched brow, a tilt of the head that dared the camera to blink. One tabloid called her Britain's #1 item for public scrutiny. Crowds surged wherever she went. Noel Coward wrote of her glittering eyes. The Express called them the most beautiful in the world. Margaret did not demur. She tilted her chin and leaned into it. Christian Dior had just unveiled his new look. Margaret embraced it with abandon. Cinched waists, silk skirts that whispered when she moved, heels that sealed her silhouette into public imagination. British women followed suit. She had become a fashion icon. Still, she was just 18 and hungry. For life, for love, for more. Her father, sensing her readiness, sent her as his official representative to Holland for the installation of Princess Juliana. Margaret, thrilled, confessed she had a sick feeling in my tummy, like before our pantomimes. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. She arrived radiant, rode canals lit by golden floodlights, and stood as principal guest at the Dutch ball. When the music began, she danced every number, every single one, with Peter Townsend. No whispers, no scandal, just a pair in motion, orbiting quietly. Without realizing, Townsend would write, I was being carried further from home and closer to the princess. Back in London, change pressed in. Elizabeth was 7 months pregnant. The king was limping. Names for the baby had already been chosen. On November 14th, as Margaret toured Yorkshire, word came, a boy. Hooray! I'm Charlie's aunt now, she cried. At the christening, she stood as godmother, the title I love most. Something harder was taking shape, a steeliness, a will. One day she attempted to break a notoriously difficult horse. She was thrown, once, twice, again. Her riding master rushed to stop her. She waved him off. On the fourth attempt, she cleared the jump, cantered back, grinning. "That's how you do it," she said. The public adored her, but the attention came with a price. Every male companion sparked rumors. Every late night lit speculation. She formed her own set: Sharman Douglas, Lady Rosemary Spencer Churchill, Judy Montagu. They haunted embassies and Chelsea nightclubs. They danced until 3. They knew every song. One evening, a photographer caught Margaret with a cigarette. The papers erupted. "Is this how a princess behaves?" She didn't flinch. "Look into my eyes," she told her dance partner. "Do you realize you're looking into the most beautiful eyes in the world?" Mockery. But also prophecy. She learned the can-can with Danny Kaye, mimicked him so perfectly she made the queen weep with laughter. She invited him to the palace, played piano as Noel Coward sang for the king. She was no longer rehearsing. She was the show. And Peter Townsend, no longer just an equerry, was always near. He escorted her to plays, accompanied her to films, rode with her at dawn. He was still master of the household, but in her world, he had become something else. A constant. In Italy, she was mobbed. Crowds screamed for La Bella Margherita. The president met her. The British ambassador toasted her. A maid was bribed to let reporters into her suite. She posed beside ancient statues and newborn lambs. She dined in sunken gardens, danced on rooftops, laughed with diplomats beneath lemon trees. And in Rome, Dalton Trumbo saw her, not just a girl, a story. That night, the seed for Roman holiday was planted. Behind the veil of champagne and lace, something quieter was beginning. Peter Townsend, once her father's equerry, stood closer now, no longer a fixture. He was the echo after the music stopped. Steady, observant, present. His marriage was failing, a casualty of war and distance. Margaret turned to him more and more, not yet in passion, but in trust. He didn't flatter, he didn't flinch. He made her laugh, he listened. And she noticed the way he looked at her, not with deference, but recognition. Her life was an unreality. Streets were scrubbed. Coal was painted white. One evening, she asked to dine at a local cafe. The manager, panicking, called in friends, dressed them in evening wear, lit candles, and staged a full house. They played their parts, sipping coffee, until Margaret and her party left at 3 a.m. "Poor girl," one guest whispered. "She hasn't the faintest idea what anyone is really like. The moment she enters the room, everyone changes." And so the curtain rose, and behind it stood Margaret, not the girl she had been, not yet the woman she would become. Not in love, but circling it, brushing its sleeve. As 1950 dawned, Margaret's story began to split. In public, she dazzled, the picture of youthful glamour. In private, she frayed. Crawfie, the old governess who had once taught her to tie bows and curtsy, betrayed the family with a memoir serialized in papers and devoured by millions. The portrait of Margaret was sharp and unkind, petulant, ill-organized, inconsiderate, and helped shape the public's view of her for years. The title of princess could no longer shield her from the narrative others would write. But that winter, her focus narrowed. The king was failing, and Margaret began to orbit closer. She stopped attending dances. She canceled appearances. She moved her piano just outside her father's bedroom door and played him to sleep. On Sundays, as the queen and king sat together listening to the radio, Margaret filled the corridor with Chopin. She hoped each time he could still hear her. Peter Townsend became a quiet fixture in these days, not in ceremony but in shadow. They rode together at dawn. He sat beside her at plays. When the court traveled, he was always near. When the day's duties ended, she found him in the stillness. One afternoon in the Scottish Highlands, Townsend fell asleep on the heather. The light was falling. A wind picked up. Margaret watched him shiver, then quietly laid a blanket over him. When he stirred, their eyes met. "You know your father is watching," he said gently. Margaret laughed, sharp and sudden, like breaking glass, then stood and turned, walking off to help her father up the stairs. But something had passed between them, a moment too intimate to name, a tenderness, still unspoken, now undeniable. Had the king known, Townsend would have been dismissed, but he was growing weaker by the week. He now walked with a cane. Margaret grew thinner, her appetite waning. Still, she took on more. Ceremonies, patronages, royal duties that piled like snow on her shoulders. In September 1951, she was appointed Counselor of State, a role of real responsibility. The palace was preparing for the end. On the evening of February 5th, 1952, Margaret played softly in the hallway as her father drifted into sleep. Elizabeth was in Kenya. The next morning, he was dead. Margaret wrote to her sister, "It will be so long until I see Papa again. Life seems so sad." When Elizabeth returned, Margaret curtsied, not to a sister, but to a queen. Then the two girls embraced and disappeared upstairs, as the world turned its face toward the new sovereign. Margaret disappeared into the background. It was Peter Townsend who held her as she cried. They spoke of Africa, of holidays, of the king's laughter, of the quiet behind his eyes. They remembered details others had forgotten. The cadence of his voice, the way he paused before entering a room. Townsend had been there for all of it. He had carried the king's gloves, read his silences, understood the structure of his soul. And now he carried Margaret's grief, gently, reverently, like a man lifting something still alive. She did not fall in love at once. She fell gradually, in gestures, in glances, in the long silences between formalities, in the way he never corrected her, never flinched when she snapped, never interrupted the pauses. She fell in love in the space left behind by death. In him, she found the father again, and something more. And so it began. A princess, luminous, watched, and aching. And a man, twice her age, already married, and now beginning divorce proceedings. The shape of the scandal had formed. All that remained was for the light to hit it. The death of the king cracked the world along invisible lines. Elizabeth became sovereign, solemn and steady, cloaked in duty. And Margaret, barely 22, drifted through Windsor and Sandringham like smoke, polite in public, but somewhere far away behind the eyes. She dressed in black. She sat alone in the pews of St. Paul's, attending Lenten lectures without fanfare. A black-clothed, sad little figure, someone called her. The press whispered about conversion, but Margaret wasn't searching for religion. She was searching for something warm, something real. And more, that something was Peter Townsend. Townsend was appointed comptroller of her mother's household, the Queen Mother, who believed he would be a stable influence on her grief-ridden daughter. At Balmoral, they walked together, always just far enough from the others to be alone, never far enough to draw suspicion. On a hilltop, they began to build a cairn, one stone added by one or the other every time they returned. No initials, no promises, just a pile of stones rising in secret, quiet, unshakable, and real. By summer, Townsend's divorce was finalized. His wife had taken a lover. The proceedings were discreet. 2 sons stayed with Peter. Then one afternoon in the red drawing room at Windsor, the quiet between them finally cracked. Townsend turned to the princess and said simply that he loved her. Margaret, without pause, replied, "That is exactly how I feel, too." No fireworks, no drama, just a soft, devastating truth spoken aloud. Townsend would later claim they didn't admit it until after the divorce. Perhaps. Or perhaps that was the fiction he needed to preserve her dignity, or his own. But anyone who had seen them walk apart from the others, who had seen the cairn rising, would have known. "We just wanted to be together," Townsend later said. But only God knew how. Margaret told the Queen. Elizabeth listened. There was no anger, no command, only a quiet request. Wait a year. Let the dust settle. Let time pass. Let love prove itself, or fade. The Queen Mother, too, was told. And for the first and only time, according to one courtier, she wept. She had lived through the abdication. She had watched another royal romance threaten the monarchy, watched her own life reshaped by a scandal named Wallis Simpson. Now her daughter stood at the edge of that same precipice. There was one shared hope, that it would end. Quietly, painlessly. That time, that great anesthetic would dull the sharpness of it all. The truth was that with Townsend being divorced, the marriage simply could not be. Had they told us we couldn't get married then, we could have handled it, but no one ever explained anything to us, Margaret later said. and so they remained together, in silence, in private, in faith. Then came the coronation, June 2nd, 1953. The abbey shimmered with red and gold. Trumpets rang, drums rolled. Elizabeth was crowned beneath vaulted glass and the hush of centuries. But not all eyes were on the Queen. There, in a robe of purple velvet, radiant in satin and pearls, stood her sister, regal, watchful, unwavering. As Margaret moved through the nave, the designer Norman Hartnell whispered she looked like a snowdrop adrift from its stem. Beautiful, brilliant, alone. Townsend was there, blue-gray uniform, medals gleaming, posture perfect. The man she loved, standing a few paces away, entirely untouchable. And then, the gesture. As the procession paused in the annex, Margaret approached him. She reached out, and with emotion so natural it could only have come from habit, brushed a piece of lint from his tunic. That was all. But it was everything. 100 cameras flashed. By morning, the secret was out. The photographs were everywhere. This was not a courtier. This was not ceremony. This was love, seen, captured, undeniable. The British press hesitated, still observing a kind of post-abdication omerta when it came to royal scandal. But abroad, the story exploded. And 12 days later, the People ran a piece that pretended to deny what it was clearly confirming. Scandalous rumors, it declared. Quite unthinkable. But the seed had sprouted. There was no burying it now. Churchill was informed. At first, he beamed. What a delightful match! A young royal princess and a war hero. But Clementine Churchill snapped him back to reality. Winston, if you're going to begin the abdication all over again, I shall take a flat in Brighton. And so the old machine rumbled back to life. The Prime Minister consulted the cabinet. Ministers were unanimous. The answer was no. The Queen was told. At first she demurred, trying to make her sister's case. But the cabinet was adamant. Townsend would have to go, not humiliated, not exiled, just removed. Quietly, respectfully. Far enough to cool things down. Peter was given a choice. Singapore, Johannesburg, Brussels. He chose Belgium, close to his sons in Kent, and close, in his mind, to her. Margaret and the Queen Mother were about to leave for a 16-day tour of Rhodesia. 54 engagements, a breakneck schedule, the perfect distraction. But Margaret was given one consolation. Townsend would not be sent away until after she returned from Rhodesia. And so, on the morning before departure, Townsend came to Clarence House to say goodbye. The Queen Mother, ever tactful, left the room. They were alone. He said she was calm. The lovers embraced, and both were confident this would not be their last meeting before his departure. She believed, as he did, that this was not an ending. That in 2 years, when she turned 25, they would find a way. Margaret flew out July 1st. Rhodesia greeted them with sun and frost, pageantry and thin smiles. A banner arched above their car, greeting Great White Queen and Great White Princess. The schedule was brutal, the weather bitter. Margaret smiled, brittle, polished, luminous, but the mask was beginning to crack. At a brief overnight stop at Leopard Rock Hotel, perched among the mountains, the Queen Mother finally told her. Peter had already left. His posting had been deliberately moved forward to July 15th, the day before her return. They would not see each other again. For 4 days, Margaret vanished. The palace called it illness. But those closest to her knew. She cried, raged, pleaded. But all of it was in vain. When she returned, her smile had changed. It was still there, but tighter now, slower to arrive, quicker to leave. The press in London, meanwhile, had lost all interest in silence. Editorials flew. Some scolded, most sympathized. And then Michael Foote, not yet labor leader, but already a voice of conscience, wrote in Tribune, "This intolerable interference in a girl's private life is all part of the absurd myth about the royal family, built up by interested parties." He named the hypocrisy. Cabinet ministers who had themselves been divorced were now condemning a young woman for falling in love. The public agreed. A Daily Mirror poll showed 95% in support of the match. Inside the palace, the scaffolding of power adjusted itself. A quiet amendment was proposed to the Regency Act of 1937. Until now, Margaret would serve as regent if the Queen died before Charles came of age. The new bill would install Prince Philip instead. A practical change, the government claimed, a natural one. But the papers speculated either Margaret was being prepared for marriage or she was being demoted. On the 21st of August 1955, Princess Margaret turned 25. Legally, that changed everything. She no longer needed her sister's permission to marry. If she wanted Peter Townsend, she could now ask Parliament, and the public was on her side. Reporters clustered outside Balmoral. Margaret waited inside. But the one thing she expected, a decision, never came. There was no statement, no meeting, just silence. Behind the scenes, the palace was paralyzed. Churchill had retired that spring. His successor, Anthony Eden, was modern and divorced. But several senior ministers threatened to resign if the marriage went forward. Another royal scandal, so soon after the abdication, could destroy everything. The Queen Mother, once quietly sympathetic, now turned cold. When Margaret asked her for advice, she said only that she was too upset to speak. The Queen herself stepped away. She was very nice, Margaret would later say, but refused to discuss it at all. The truth was that the Queen had just taken the throne and had little power to disobey her ministers. Whatever she may have felt privately for her sister, her duty was to the country. Meanwhile, Eden and his wife arrived at Balmoral for the annual prime ministerial visit. Discussions took place. Decisions were weighed. But Margaret was not invited. Not even once. The morning Margaret left for London to see Townsend again, the Queen took the dogs for a walk. Long enough to avoid her. Still, she hoped. On the 13th of October, Peter returned from Brussels. For the next 19 days, they tried to live. They drank tea with the Queen Mother. They dined with friends. They spent a weekend hiding at a cousin's country house, trying to feel normal. But the press turned it into a siege. Reporters bribed servants. Photographers chased cars. Helicopters buzzed the skies. One journalist tried to buy information from a 7-year-old with chocolate. Still, they held on. Still, they believed. Then, on October 22nd, the Queen unveiled a statue of their father. Margaret stood beside her. The Queen's speech cut like glass. Much was asked of my father in personal sacrifice. He shirked no task. He never faltered in his duty. For Margaret, the message was unmistakable. Duty had been defined, and Peter was not part of it. On October 23rd, she traveled to Windsor. There, she finally learned the truth. If she married Townsend, she would lose everything. Her title, her income, her place in the family. Parliament would not approve the match. A bill would be passed to remove her from the line of succession. She would become Mrs. Townsend, married outside the church, living abroad, supported by whatever salary he could earn. The Queen did not forbid it, but she offered no protection. The Duke of Edinburgh was more direct. Townsend, he told her, could not be part of the future. That night, Margaret phoned Peter. She didn't say what had been discussed. Her voice was cracking. Her confidence was gone. And Townsend, listening in silence, knew it was over. They met again on Monday, the 24th. Townsend had already drafted a renunciation statement, something she could use if she needed it. They sat together and edited it, line by line. Our feelings were unchanged, he would write, but the burden had become too great. We decided together to lay it down. They submitted the draft to the palace. The Queen's private secretary and press secretary tried to suppress it. They especially objected to the word devotion, but Margaret held the line. The words stayed in. 4 days later, on October 31st, the statement was broadcast to the world. I have decided not to marry Group Captain Townsend. I have been strengthened by his unfailing support and devotion. I have put duty before all else. The world exhaled, but Margaret did not. There were no tears on the palace steps, no visible collapse, but those closest to her saw something different, a stillness, a kind of shock that hadn't found its language. Yet one thing remained. They had not said goodbye. Townsend requested one last meeting. Arrangements were made in secret. They escaped to Uckfield House, the Sussex home of Lord Rupert Neville, a borrowed refuge. The press found them anyway. Planes circled. Photographers bribed the staff. Still, for 2 days they were together. There was no pleading, no last-minute revolt, just two people who understood, with perfect clarity, that the decision had already been made. and that their future had split in two. On Monday evening, Margaret returned to Clarence's house. Townsend followed. In her sitting room, they said goodbye. Neither of them ever repeated what was said. "Without dishonor," Townsend wrote, "we had played out our destiny." He drove back through the streets of London, then on to Brussels. As he crossed the Channel, her statement was echoing across the world. Commentators called it noble. Clergy called it devout. Parliament congratulated itself, but none of them had been in the room. At Covent Garden, she had sat beside the Duke of Edinburgh and not spoken a word. At church, she bowed her head. She smiled at dinner. She did not falter. But there was a cost. She had lost the only man she had ever truly chosen. Some said she sacrificed love for the church. Others said it was fear or duty or obedience. Some believed she had been forced. Others said she chose it freely. But all of them missed the point. Margaret bore it alone. And she bore it silently. Years later, she spoke of that autumn only once. "I was never allowed to explain." But long before those words, she had said something simpler. To a friend, quietly, with no audience and no defense. It hurt too much. Years later, she would enter an abusive marriage, one that would all but destroy her. And she only accepted the proposal days after learning that Townsend had married. Near the end of her life, after all the scandals, the abuse, the alcoholism, and the public fall, Margaret saw Tommy Lascelles pass by, the man who in the early days of the affair had so vehemently argued to Churchill and the Queen against the match. She leaned to her friend and said simply, "There goes the man who ruined my life." After the Renunciation, Margaret did not retreat. She danced. Within days of losing Peter Townsend, she was back at balls, nightclubs, and premieres, champagne in hand, cigarette holder angled like punctuation, laughter pitched just a little too high. She stayed out past 3, surrounding herself with musicians, actors, Americans, anyone loud enough to drown the ache. She saw Kismet 5 times, Cinerama 4. She sang along to "You Can't Chop Your Mama Up in Massachusetts." Lena Horne, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, all of them played to her applause. Louis Armstrong spotted her from the stage, grinned, and called her one hip chick, dedicating Mahogany Hall Stomp to her. She glowed, she performed, she applauded as if her life depended on it. She was no longer simply the Queen's sister. She was becoming something else entirely, the modern princess. At court, eyebrows rose, but the cameras adored her. Her clothes were impeccable, her eyeliner a quiet threat, her expression always carrying the hint of a smirk, as though she knew the ending and everyone else was reading the wrong script. Yet beneath the glitter the whispers grew, lonely, mercurial, brittle. She fulfilled her duties, opened hospitals, laid wreaths, shook countless hands, but night was where she lived. One by one, the old Margaret set married, settled, scattered. She remained. In 1956, she embarked on the Blue Lagoon tour of East Africa, a dazzling showcase of modern monarchy. In Kenya, she watched tribal dances. In Zanzibar, she visited the Sultan. In Mauritius, she drank rum for the ghost said to haunt Government House. In Mombasa, she took coffee behind a lattice screen with women in Purdah, who gave her a miniature sword symbolizing the duties of men now shouldered by women. But the moment that lingered was quieter. In Tanganyika, she met a tall, tanned district commissioner. His name was Townsend, Peter's younger brother. She smiled and moved on. Back in London, the matchmaking continued. Princes, peers, heirs. Prince Christian of Hanover, King Baudouin of the Belgians, Prince Nicholas of Yugoslavia. But none of it held. Only one man remained, Billy Wallace. Tall, chinless, kind. He had proposed for years, she had always refused. But now, with so many gone and the word spinster circling like a carrion bird, she said yes, unofficially. If the Queen approved, she would marry him. Wallace went to the Bahamas, had a brief affair, and confessed. Furious, she ended it and would not speak to him for years. By 1957, her reputation had begun to harden. Friends called her erratic. Staff whispered about her moods. She could be incandescent or ice. She stayed out until dawn. She made guests wait while she changed outfits, sometimes 3 times in one evening. She insisted on bottled water for her whiskey, even in other people's homes. Nancy Mitford wrote that at one dinner meant to begin at 8:30, her hairdresser arrived at 8:30, and Margaret did not come down until after 10, sporting a ghastly hairdo that made her look, Mitford said, like a ball of fur. She smoked endlessly. She sliced through conversations that bored her, and still she was the brightest thing in every room. That autumn, the Queen hosted a family dinner for her 10th wedding anniversary. Margaret didn't come. She went to the Savoy instead, then slipped into the palace just before midnight, laughing. Her behavior was inexplicable, one attendant said. In 1958, the phone rang. Peter. He had completed a 60,000-mile tour to forget her. It hadn't worked. He asked to see her. She agreed. They met at Clarence House on the 26th of March. The press exploded. They're together again. The Queen was abroad in the Netherlands. Rumors swarmed. Margaret was accused of stealing the spotlight, Townsend of exploiting her. The palace panicked. Their next meeting was canceled. He sent 4 dozen roses. When she called, her voice was brittle. I've been persuaded not to see you again. But they met again in May, 3 times in 1 week. A foreign newspaper announced an engagement. The palace for once responded. Her Royal Highness's statement of 1955 remains unaltered. Hounded by press and palace alike, they had no choice but to end it. On the 20th of May, they met for the last time at Clarence House. Quiet. Final. Public curiosity, Townsend wrote, killed our long and faithful attachment. That evening, warmly, affectionately, we said adieu. They would not meet again for over 30 years. By the summer of 1959, Margaret was still unmarried. She turned 29. Then came the letter. Peter had met a 19-year-old Belgian heiress. He was in love. He was getting married. She read the letter in the morning. That night, she accepted a proposal from Antony Armstrong-Jones. It was no coincidence, Margaret said. It would be the greatest mistake of her life. In February 1958, Princess Margaret attended a quiet dinner party in Chelsea, the sort of evening where everything glittered politely. Good silver, soft laughter, familiar faces. The host was Lady Elizabeth Cavendish, her closest confidant. Margaret was 27, still dazzling, still unmarried, still living beneath the shadow of a decision the world insisted she had chosen. Across the table sat a man no one expected her to notice. Antony Armstrong-Jones, Tony, was not a duke, not a general, not a man of lineage or acreage. He was slight, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, a photographer, a commoner, a curiosity. He had a voice that smiled, a mouth made for secrets, and unlike every man who'd ever faced her, he didn't flinch. She leaned in. He belonged to a different class, not the kind catalogued in debrettes, but one stitched together by appetite and instinct. His father was a Welsh barrister, his mother, Anne Messel, a beauty who had married up, divorced, and married up again. Tony had drifted between country estates and grimy studios, sickly from childhood polio, falling short in height and in pedigree. He had failed at science, failed at architecture, nearly failed at everything until he found the camera. Behind it, he was electric. He shot actors, dancers, debutantes, designers. He photographed a young queen and her children. He lived with one foot in the aristocracy, one in the avant-garde, and a bed often shared by friends of both sexes. No one quite knew how to place him, which made him irresistible, especially to Margaret, who felt the cage of royal life even when it was velvet-lined. He didn't flatter her. He teased. He slipped past her rank as though it were only a costume. He made her laugh, and then he made her think. The evening passed like a flicker, but a door had opened, and she stepped through. Townsend was still a ghost then, distant and fading. But by the time that final chapter closed in May, Tony was already beside her. She sat for him soon after and liked the way he took charge, adjusting her pose, instructing her gently, seeing her without reverence. They shared jokes, gossiped, mimicked accents. Both were gifted at performance. Friendship blurred, then became something else. They kept it hidden. Margaret slipped out of Clarence House at dusk, sometimes with a lady-in-waiting, sometimes alone. She met Tony at his Bermondsey flat, a small white room above a junk shop facing the Thames. The toilet was shared. The furniture mismatched. There was a mattress, a portable record player, and a view of Tower Bridge. She called it deliciously strange and romantic. They drank cheap red wine, ate shepherd's pie, slept late. He called her pet. They washed their own dishes, dried them with tea towels, sunbathed on the roof. When the tide rose, the swans knocked at the windows. It wasn't royal. It was real. And for the first time in years, she felt alive. He showed her contact sheets. She gave her opinion, and he listened. She brought him books, records, gossip from the palace. He taught her to see light. She taught him how to enter a room without apology. For months, no one suspected. Many assumed Tony wasn't interested in women. Others believed he was using her. But Margaret, always royal, never naive, knew better. She wasn't seeking a fairy tale. She wanted danger. Not a crown, a spark. And Tony gave her that. By 1959, the whispers had begun. Margaret posed for her 29th birthday portrait, not with Cecil Beaton, but with Tony. It was the first time anyone outside the royal family had been granted the honor. When Beaton learned of it, she said simply, "I've been unfaithful to you." The Queen and Queen Mother said nothing. After Townsend, there could be no more banns. Tony wasn't divorced. That was enough. The Queen Mother even liked his wit and his rudeness. He was the only man in Margaret's orbit who didn't curtsy with his tongue. Then came October. Balmoral, the river gray, the heather brittle. A letter arrived. Peter Townsend had met someone, a 19-year-old Belgian girl. He was engaged. Margaret said nothing, but the wound deepened. That night, she told Tony, and despite her protests, he proposed. Sometime before dawn, she said yes. Later, she would insist she had never truly wanted to marry. Why did I? Because he asked me. He gave her a ring, ruby and diamonds, shaped like a flower. They told no one. The Queen found out in January at Sandringham, pregnant with Andrew. Tony was summoned for New Year's, ostensibly to show her a pergola he'd designed. He arrived with the model. He was shown into a room. The Queen waited alone. He asked permission to marry her sister. She granted it. Moments later, Margaret, the Queen Mother, and Prince Philip joined them. There was champagne, a photograph, smiles. The engagement was kept secret for weeks. Then, on the 26th of February 1960, 7 days after Andrew's birth, it was announced, "It is with the greatest pleasure that Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, announces the betrothal of her beloved daughter." The public exhaled. For the first time in years, Margaret was adored, not pitied. She had chosen someone ordinary, modern, wholly hers. He would be the first commoner in 4 centuries to marry a monarch's daughter. Photographers stormed his Pimlico studio. Tony was moved to Buckingham Palace, fitted for suits, sculpted into a consort. But not everyone was pleased. Lady Pembroke remembered him being seated in the servants' hall after photographing her at Wilton. Cecil Beaton called him nondescript, ratty, not worthy of this strange fluke. His father, honeymooning with his 3rd wife, said flatly, "I wish to God this hadn't happened. He won't walk 2 steps behind anyone." Even his friends doubted. Jocelyn Stevens cabled from the Bahamas. "Never has there been a more ill-fated assignment." European royals declined to attend. Wallace Simpson scoffed from abroad. "At least I'm keeping up with the Joneses," but Margaret was triumphant. There were warning signs. She snapped at Tony when he said to a footman, "Be a darling and get us some tea." "That's not how you speak to staff," she hissed, sharp, cold. Tony's best man, Jeremy Fry, was removed when palace security uncovered a past homosexual offense. His replacement, Jeremy Thorpe, was also rejected for the same reason. The Queen and Queen Mother had long tolerated gay courtiers. The fear was not morality, it was scandal. The wedding took place on 6th of May 1960, a clean blue day, the first royal wedding ever televised. 20 million watched. Margaret wore white silk organza, no lace, no beading, no embroidery, designed by Hartnell but based on Tony's sketch. Severe, pure, uncompromising. The Poltimore tiara rose above her brow like winter light. She wore no necklace. Tony wore morning dress, not uniform. They looked perfect and small beneath the weight of gold and expectation. At the vows, Margaret spoke too soon. "For better, for worse," she said, a line ahead of the Archbishop. It passed unnoticed by most, but not forgotten. Outside, the city roared, petals fell, the glass coach rolled. At Tower Bridge, Britannia slipped beneath the steel as the couple waved, two figures cut from storybook paper. Noel Coward watched from his drawing room and wept. It was moving and romantic, he wrote. My eyes were full of tears. She had done it. She had chosen. She had broken the pattern. That night, they sailed. Margaret in pale yellow shantung, Tony quiet beside her in the glow of duty and astonishment. The crowds waved until their arms ached. But the honeymoon would be short, and the sea ahead, calm as it looked, would not stay gentle for long. The newlyweds glided from one Caribbean shore to another, laughing on deck, listening to records, drinking rum that smelled like warm sugar. For the first time in years, she was off script. No ribbon cuttings, no stiff smiles, no headlines speculating on her womb. She was, for a moment, just a woman, and she meant to enjoy it. Then came Mustique, May 26th. Britannia dropped anchor off a roadless spit of volcanic rock. Colin Tennant, her old friend, met the yacht beaming. The island was his, 3 miles long, thick with hibiscus and heat. When her engagement was announced, he had asked, a box from Asprey or a plot of land? She chose the land, 10 acres, no electricity, no plumbing, just cliffs and sea and something that felt like freedom. She stood on the headland above the bay and saw it all, space, escape, a private myth. Tony said little. To him, it was a performance, a stage gift from a man who had known her longer, offered not to them, but to her, the early scent of second place. And the wound ran deeper than Mystique. Years earlier, Tony had photographed Tennant's wedding to Lady Coke and felt dismissed, even insulted. He never set foot on Mystique again. At the same time, Tony's first daughter was born, Polly Fry. For years, he had been entangled in a ménage à trois with Jocelyn and Camilla Fry. During one of the house parties held during his engagement to Margaret, Camilla became pregnant. Tony never claimed the child, never spoke of her. And it wasn't until DNA tests in 2004 that her parentage was confirmed. Back in London, they were given number 10 Kensington Palace, 10 rooms in the so-called ant heap, where royal widows and unwanted relics were tucked away like heirloom china. Margaret toured it once and called it a doll's house. It wasn't enough for the life she meant to lead. They hired 7 staff, a butler, driver, footman, cook, housemaid, personal maid, and housekeeper. The wine was expensive, the standards higher. Within weeks, the staff were whispering. The butler, Thomas Cronin, loathed Tony's informality. He bristled when Tony questioned accounts, resented being denied a third charwoman. The final straw, Tony snapped his fingers. Just once. Cronin never forgave it. Even Margaret clashed with him. After a luncheon, she pulled him aside. Unless the Queen is present, she said coldly, you serve me first, regardless of the rank of my guests. Cronin resigned and marched straight to the people. The highest possible honor, he declared, for the lowest possible wage. In royal parlance, he had done a crawfie. Within a year, 2 more butlers and Margaret's personal maid had left. By autumn, they had moved. Not far, just grander. Apartment 1A, 21 rooms, a private garden, ceilings untouched since Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise, had lived there. Tony oversaw the renovations, styled the walls kingfisher blue, built a dark room in the basement, installed life-sized blackamoor statues with torch lamps. The total cost? £85,000. £50,000 came from the Ministry of Works. The remaining £35,000, said to be from the Queen's personal funds, was in truth public money, funneled discreetly through a grant in aid. The press exploded. Thousands are homeless, said MP Willie Hamilton, and this is how a kept woman lives. The Daily Mail called them the 2 highest-paid performing dwarfs in Europe. Tony tried to adjust. He had always been active, and royal life, playing number 2, began to bore him. He joined the Council for Industrial Design, helped design an aviary at London Zoo, and was mocked. Britain's premier birdcage architect, the papers sneered. Then came the Sunday Times. With Margaret's help, she had spoken to Jocelyn Stevens. He was appointed artistic advisor to the New Colour magazine. £5,000 salary. A place to stand. The press howled, he's cashing in on the crown. Still, London watched them with fascination, and they became Britain's most glamorous couple. Margaret still sparkled, plunging Dior gowns, diamond earrings swinging like punctuation. Her hair rose higher, her lipstick turned ice pink. Tony tinted his hair peach, wore velvet jackets, a silk polo neck to dinner at the palace. They bought a Mini, were spotted on the underground, visited street markets. Sometimes Margaret rode behind him on his motorbike. In the years of dissolving class barriers, they mingled with designers, dancers, actors, and poets. The Beatles, Rudolf Nureyev, Peter Sellers. Still, they kept their rituals. They sparked off each other. When the princess had to give a speech, Tony helped shape her words. When she spoke, he never took his eyes off her. At royal visits, they were a team. The ambassador of Denmark wrote, "The Danes loved you both." They made a home movie with Peter Sellers for the Queen's 39th birthday. Margaret played herself, blowing a kiss at the camera. Tony played a golfer and a flamboyant gangster. Tony brought home his people. Directors, painters, boys in eyeliner, girls in leather. Margaret drifted through them with a cigarette and a joke, but her eyes didn't soften. She wanted to be a bohemian, someone said, but she still expected everyone to stand when she entered the room. No one could behave naturally when she was there, one friend said. And if someone didn't show her deference, she'd simply walk out. We all felt like we were walking on eggshells. Once, at a screening of avant-garde films, she offered her hand to Vivian Merchant. The actress refused. "So I drew it back," Margaret said later, "as if it were meant for someone else." She laughed. But the hurt lived in the gesture. By then, the question of titles had re-emerged. Margaret was pregnant. The royal family couldn't have a Mr. Armstrong-Jones in the line of succession. He chose to be the Earl of Snowdon, admiring the mountain and honoring his Welsh heritage. The press rolled their eyes. The Sunday people mourned his lost identity. One wit put it best: they made a mountain out of a molehill. On November 3rd, 1961, their son was born, David Albert Charles. The portrait was complete. A perfect family, if only in stillness. 2 weeks later, they left the baby with a nanny and flew to the Caribbean, buying up the entire first-class section of the plane. The press turned. Margaret, they wrote, was high-handed, pleasure-loving, self-indulgent. She called them vultures, but the palace demanded silence. There would be no reply, but the cracks were forming. Often, by midnight, Tony would stand, lift a glass, nod, time to end the evening. Margaret would wave it off, not yet, and no one left until she gave the signal. Not even her husband. Still, they were close. They drank red wine in Bermondsey, went to the theater in disguise. Once they threw their old bed out the window and watched it drift down the Thames. It moved sluggishly, Tony said, upriver and out of our lives. She gave in to Tony's wishes and broke royal tradition by spending New Year abroad. She and Tony fled to Castle Birr, her mother-in-law's turreted Irish fortress, all Gothic shadows and frosty formalities. Margaret found the Irish too hardy, she said later, too devoted to the sporting life. She mocked Lady Ross's insistence on dressing for dinner. Lady Ross was only allowed to call her darling after a curtsy. She was really wicked, said one guest. She never told Tony's mother what to call her and treated her appallingly. 2 years later, they returned to Ireland. The country had changed, louder, angrier. The IRA saw Margaret as royalty wrapped in arrogance. Explosions. Pamphlets, roadblocks. Her Garda escort tried to sneak her to the runway behind a follow-me car, but the wrong car was followed. 2 confused American tourists were taken to her plane. Margaret was left behind in the crowd. The mob thumped on the roof. Then they began to sing, "For she's a jolly good fellow. Next time bring your mother. And the horse." "What if it doesn't win?" quipped Margaret. "It will," one said coolly. "We'll carry it round." That was Margaret. Weaponized charm, always armed, but not always unscathed. She preferred other places. In 1963, they went to Spetsa, the private island of Stavros Niarchos. Ancient ruins, Aegean light, money that never touched the ground. Margaret wandered the marble barefoot in cotton dresses. Then came Sardinia. The Aga Khan gave them his yacht and the best suite at the Hotel Patriza. Wherever they went, they were in demand. Not to meet them was like being in the Garden of Eden without seeing God, one hostess said. And on May 1st, 1964, she gave birth to a daughter. At the christening reception, Tony's father asked about the old flat. The Queen Mother, who adored Tony, asked to see it. On the way, they stopped so Her Majesty could peer into a tattoo parlor on Waterloo Road. "I haven't enjoyed myself so much since I was 20, she said. In 1964, they joined Jocelyn Stevens and his wife in Venice. Margaret planned everything, clipboard in hand, and quizzed them nightly about Giotto and frescoes. The next year they were back, driving Snowdon's new Aston Martin, dining with Judy Montagu, and even granted an audience with the Pope. Years later, Margaret said, almost flatly, "That was the last really happy holiday Tony and I spent together." They had crafted something, a myth, a moment, a portrait of modern monarchy, but it was beginning to crumble. Lord Snowdon began to pull away. The grand house, the curtsies, the palace protocols. What once amused him now curdled. He buried himself in work, flying across the world to photograph faces far from Windsor's corridors. At home, he withdrew into his dark room, cigarette smoke, camera lenses, and silence. Margaret was not invited. "I am not a member of the royal family," he snapped once. "I am married to a member of the royal family." One day she entered his studio unannounced. "Never come in here without knocking," he said sharply. Another afternoon, she asked gently if he'd be in for lunch. He didn't lower the paper. "Darling, I'm listening," he murmured, eyes still hidden. "Well, will you be home for lunch?" she pressed. No, she left. The door slammed, a mirror shattered behind it. At a charity ball, her own, she saw him dancing with the same girl all evening. She crossed the floor. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked. "Very much so, ma'am," he said. "Well," she said, voice glacial, "that's enough for one evening. Run along home." He didn't dance again that night. The worst fight wasn't over a woman, but a house. She wanted Sunninghill, elegant, Windsor adjacent, a place where her mother might drop in. They had once water skied there. It felt like a future she could endure. Tony preferred Old House, a crumbling Sussex cottage on his family's land. She said it was remote, inaccessible, haunted. A mediator ruled in her favor. Tony ignored it. He rebuilt Old House behind her back and invited the Queen Mother to cut the ribbon. Margaret stayed home. Still, the show went on. Still, they waved. Denmark, the Netherlands, Uganda, and then America. Late 1965, they arrived to flashbulbs and fanfare, Hollywood stars, a White House dinner. Margaret wore pink and silver. One paper called them a bride and groom on top of a wedding cake. But the frosting was cracking. When Elizabeth Taylor received the Krupp diamond 33 carats the size of a knuckle, Margaret murmured, "The most vulgar thing I've ever seen." Word got back. At a party, Taylor offered the ring. "Would you like to try it on?" Margaret slid it onto her finger. Taylor smiled. "Doesn't look so vulgar now, does it?" At the Beverly Hills Hotel, Margaret sent word to Judy Garland she'd like to hear her sing. "Tell that nasty, rude little princess," Garland snapped, "that if she wants a performance, she can come christen a ship first." She had once been the woman who could stop time in a room. Now she was being told to leave the stage, and the curtains weren't even drawn. Tony's private view was launching in the U.S. He was interviewed, celebrated, photographed. He never mentioned Margaret. One magazine called him the man most American women wanted to be stranded with. She read it in silence. When Tony was away from home, he neither wrote nor telephoned. Margaret would ring everyone she knew trying to get a hold of him, and he would simply ignore her. And as he pulled away, she became more possessive. She told friends she felt she was married to a stranger. She would show up at restaurants hoping to find him, ring studios where she thought he would be. When he would return home, he would immediately go downstairs to his study and ignore her calls to come upstairs and join her. When he left on his business trips, she would fall into tears. She had always been adored by her father, by Townsend, by everyone she met. She simply had no idea how to deal with this change in the man she believed she loved. Abroad, he would go out to parties, meet old girlfriends, and carry on affairs. All while Margaret desperately tried to reach him. The more she reached, the further back he drew. For him, working relationships and sexual affairs were one and the same. At one party, as Margaret telephoned, a model was sitting on his lap as he made signs to the person who answered the phone that he was unavailable. She began calling friends at night, sometimes friends of friends, people she barely knew. "I'm not loved," she whispered, or simply, "Where is he?" Into that vacuum stepped Anthony Barton, Tony's friend and her daughter's godfather. He listened, held her hand. They began an affair. Jocelyn Stevens believed it was encouraged by Tony himself. He wanted her distracted, he said, a way to soothe his mind for all the affairs he was having. Margaret confided in several people, even Barton's wife. Some said it was guilt, others said revenge. But if she wanted fury or even forgiveness, she got neither. Just a shrug. Keep it private next time, he said. Despite the fights and betrayals, their marriage remained physical for a time. But even that cooled. He looked at her now with antipathy. She drank famous grouse daily, smoked until her fingers yellowed, stayed in bed and called whoever would answer. By early 1967, she was admitted to hospital. Officially, a checkup. Unofficially, too much whiskey, too many pills, too many 2 a.m. silences. She had grown up believing love was applause. But the world had gone quiet, and no one told her what to do when the ovation stopped. She was 37. The rooms were emptier. And into that silence walked Robin Douglas Home. Robin Douglas Home was not a duke, not a diplomat, not even particularly dependable. But he had a piano, and he knew how to listen. He was a society flirt, a failed novelist, a man who betrayed even his friends, publishing Sinatra's secrets, leaking Jackie Kennedy's confidences to the press. And yet, for a few brittle weeks in 1966, he was everything Margaret needed. While Tony vanished on long assignments, not calling, not writing, Robin played Cole Porter under soft lighting. Gershwin drifted through Kensington Palace. Margaret sang along, cigarette in hand, aching for the illusion of something private, something tender, something hers. They met in her rooms in his modest Cromwell Road flat. They slipped away to his Sussex cottage. He wrote her letters, long, musical, coded in metaphor. But the press were watching too. The whispers began. That she was unfaithful. That she was abandoned. That the fairy tale had failed. Cornered in New York, Tony gave the perfect line. I keep in constant touch with my wife. A lie, but a useful one. He appeared so composed the Queen herself wrote to praise his televised performance. Both she and the Queen Mother had long been charmed by Tony. Margaret, in contrast, was often seen, even within the family, as imperious, heavy-handed, too much. In the squabbles behind palace doors, they often took his side. Divorce was unthinkable. Separation, unmanageable. The myth had to hold for the children, for the crown. So a new act was staged. Margaret flew to New York, met Tony at the airport, and together they smiled their way to the Bahamas while the paparazzi snapped their story. Robin was shattered. True to form, he sold Margaret's letters. 18 months later, after another failed affair, he took his own life. And the marriage, already silent, already cold, remained intact. In public, in photographs, in protocol, in private, it was something else entirely. As the Bahamas smiles faded and the headlines dissolved, Margaret placed a quiet call to Colin Tennant. Years ago, he'd offered her a plot of land on his island of Mustique. She had laughed then. Now she was ready to claim it. Tony refused to design the house. He would not visit the island. Margaret began visiting twice a year, February, then late autumn. A rhythm of escape. But each return came with a louder chorus of judgment. Photographs of her poolside, laughing, drinking, left the tabloids insatiable. Mustique, once a gift, had become a mirror, reflecting what Britain feared she'd become, a Sybarite, detached, disgraced. In time, the island would host one of the most scandalous episodes of her life. The press called her a freeloader, a scandal magnet, someone who brought shame to the palace. She was compared unfavorably to her sister, who symbolized duty, and the fairy tale princess who had once charmed the public was now caught in a narrative she couldn't control. No one saw her charity work, her endless touring and works with hospitals. What they saw was a hedonistic party girl, using public funds to finance her lavish lifestyle. And Margaret, trained to never explain or never deny, felt utterly alone. She wasn't fleeing duty. She was fleeing performance. The act, the illusion, the cold choreography of royal marriage. If she couldn't leave the institution, she would leave the room, the country, the script. The year was 1969, and as Margaret floundered, Tony soared. Carnarvon Castle, he staged the investiture of Prince Charles. Stark, minimalist, modern. No velvet, no brocade, just slate, perspex, and perfect geometry. He was hailed as brilliant, visionary. Margaret, draped in pastels and pearls, smiled for the cameras. But she was no longer the spectacle. She was the shadow beside him. Tony's career flourished. His documentaries, Don't Count the Candles, Happy Being Happy, Born to be Small, won awards. He invented mobility aids for the disabled. He gave interviews, received honors. Margaret received scorn. At one palace banquet, she stood beside her sister and Labour Minister Barbara Castle. Castle complimented the Queen's shimmering gown. Elizabeth beamed. Margaret cut in. "That's rather prominent, darling," she said, pointing to a medal. "Well, it does rather stick out." Then she drifted off, muttering, "I suppose we ought to permeate." That was Margaret now. Brittle, barbed, unreachable. When actor Gordon Jackson praised Tony's film about dwarfism, she winced. "Bit too near home," she said. It was a joke. No one laughed. While Tony dined with models and curated his image, Margaret watched the page turn. She hadn't changed, but the world had, and she was still standing where it left her, alone. By now, the couple were barely on speaking terms. At parties, they would never be seated together and would hardly say a word to each other throughout the night. Then came Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, 23, beautiful, harmless. The kind of aristocratic waif Margaret collected like cufflinks. Tony visited her family often, dined, charmed, lingered too long. Margaret liked her, invited her to the palace, thought nothing of it, but others did. In December 1970, at the premiere of The Magic Christian, Margaret sat with Patrick Litchfield and Jocelyn Stevens. Tony sat beside Jackie. The flashbulbs didn't lie. Over the months that followed, their flirtation turned physical. Tony used his camera as a passport, arranging sittings, making himself necessary, and then, in January, the curtain tore. The New York Daily News broke the story. The princess's husband was having an affair with a debutante. The press screamed, the nation smirked, and for once, Margaret had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter. She became the punchline anyway, the woman who always invited disaster, even when it wasn't her fault. Jackie went silent. Tony denied everything and admitted nothing. The affair ended, but the performance cracked. Another round of photographs followed. She and Tony flew to the West Indies, smiled on the beach, walked in sunshine, but the British public was done clapping. The Lady Jackie affair wasn't the end of the marriage, but it was the end of the myth. The world had stopped pretending, and so had they. After Jackie, after the headlines, after the silence, Margaret began collecting men like talismans. Some were old lovers returning from the margins. Others were fantasies, escape valves. There were whispers of Mick Jagger, of Margaret giggling like a schoolgirl, her hand on his knee, drunk on his magnetism and mischief. But the most persistent and most deranged was Peter Sellers. The comedian had long orbited the Snowdon's world. His goon show made Charles laugh until he cried. He ingratiated himself with the Queen Mother, gave birthday films to the Queen, gifted lenses and gadgets to Tony, even handed over his daughter's pony for Margaret's children. He called Margaret Ma'am Darling, wrote her letters, played host in his lavish Clarges Street apartment, told the clairvoyant Maurice Woodruff that he was having an affair with her, told his friends he might marry her. To Margaret, he was entertainment. To himself, he was a contender. Once, when her detective approached the door of his apartment, Sellers greeted him disguised as an old butler, while a tape of party chatter blared behind him. It worked. The detective left, convinced she wasn't alone. He grew possessive, jealous. Once, as a joke, he rang Margaret pretending to be Tony and described, in graphic detail, his imaginary nights with Lady Jackie. This time, she didn't laugh. She later called him the most difficult man I know, but she kept him close. He gave her something the palace no longer could: distraction, adoration, a stage. Back at home, things were collapsing in silence. Tony no longer shouted. He vanished, left Margaret notes instead of words. One read, 20 reasons why I hate you. He grew leaner, sharper, colder. She grew rounder, softer, slower. Her drinking deepened. The tabloids circled, smelling decline. One private eye cover showed the couple grinning through a car window. "What's all this about us fighting in public?" she asks. "Shut up, you fat bitch, and keep smiling," he replies. Most couples would have divorced by now. But Margaret wasn't most women. And Snowdon wasn't just a man. He was an earl, the Queen's brother-in-law, the father of royal children. Divorce wasn't simply scandal. It was rupture. And no one in the palace wanted to tear the fabric again. Not after Wallace. The Queen Mother still saw Snowdon's charm, still called him Tony, still thought Margaret, in her moods and vanities, had brought it on herself. The Queen was more measured, but made it clear divorce would damage the crown. Margaret was trapped, so the performance continued, bitter, brittle, and badly lit. Their final holidays together were a masterclass in quiet humiliation. Sardinia, 1973. They brought the children, David, 11, sensitive and solemn like his father. Sarah, 9, observant, gentle, more like Margaret. Margaret hoped their presence might thaw the frost. It didn't. Tony was bolshy from the start, she later said. Late for meals, or not turning up at all. And more than anything, he was rude to me in front of the children. "Papa, Mummy is talking to you," one child said gently at dinner. "I know," came the flat reply. He left within a week, flying back to London without warning. There were scenes elsewhere too. Barbados, the princess, though suffering from a migraine, insisted on attending a Red Cross ball, not out of glamour, but obligation. She knew her presence sold tickets. At midnight, she was ready to go. Tony was nowhere to be found. A detective searched, nothing. Finally, a friend was dispatched. He found Snowdon under a table with a shop assistant. Told the princess was waiting, Tony sneered, "Fuck off, arselicker." They hauled him upright and delivered him to the car. Margaret waited, headache pounding, dignity dissolving. Even dinners became dangerous. At a gathering for John Betjeman, Snowdon was bright, charming, surrounded by friends. Margaret, tense, silent, barely acknowledged the poet James Lees Milne. He later described her as cross, exacting, too sophisticated, and sharp. By 1972, even Parliament had turned on her. Margaret's annual allowance, set at £15,000 when she married, was now proposed to be raised to £35,000. The palace said it barely covered her staff, her car, her palace upkeep. Inflation had made it absurd. She'd taken on 117 official duties that year. She'd visited Canada, Italy, France, the Virgin Islands. But the Select Committee wasn't convinced. They saw the headlines, the photographs, the shrinking public goodwill. They saw Mystique, and they voted to abolish her annuity entirely. Since the princess has a working husband, the committee wrote, and her public engagements appear extremely limited, free housing should be adequate recompense for services rendered. In other words, she was a kept woman, expensive and expendable. Margaret was livid. "I don't spend it on champagne," she said. "I spend it on secretaries and light bulbs." On the front pages, headlines asked, "Is she worth it? Does she earn it?" The vote passed. Her annuity survived, but the damage didn't. She walked through Kensington Palace that week with her chin up and her heels sharper. But her body told the truth. The weight, the slow stride, the constant cigarette. She was tired of being mocked, tired of pretending not to hear it. At a dinner party, when a harsh overhead light made everyone wince, Margaret raised her hand dramatically to her brow and peered about in mock despair. Half Norma Desmond, half West End farce. She still loved an entrance. Still gave parties with carols and cigars, with showgirls and secretaries, with fading dukes and jazz singers. Cleo Lane remembered her arriving late, interrupting with introductions. "Lord so-and-so, Lady Doodah, the Han What's-It, you know my sister." She still had allies, old ones, like Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's last granddaughter, hard of hearing, dignified in her courtyard rooms just opposite. "She's so pretty," Alice said, "so lively, so intelligent." Margaret would bellow across the sitting room to talk to her. "If only I could get past Miss Goldie," she'd joke. "I'd visit her more often." When Princess Alice told her she once met a woman who danced at the Duchess of Richmond's ball on the eve of Waterloo, Margaret told her own children to remember that. In your old age, you'll be able to say you knew someone who was there. The past mattered to her. The performance mattered. Even when she hated it, Because if she wasn't the princess, if she stopped playing, what was left? Then she met Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25, a dreamer, a drifter, soft-eyed, soft-handed, soft-voiced, and unformed. He studied poetry and plants, wore his hair long, laughed too easily, floated through life like pollen. When Margaret met him at a lunch arranged to even out a house party, he didn't own a swimsuit. She took him shopping. They picked out Union Jack trunks together. That week at Glen, they swam, walked, sang at the piano. She called it magical. He reminded her of Tony before Tony turned cruel, small, dark, broken in the right places. But Roddy was soft where Tony had been sharp. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel too much. She felt adored for exactly what she was. She held his hand. She laughed. She called him my darling angel. And for a moment, the wound stopped bleeding. Even the children accepted it. She telephoned Roddy constantly, bought sheets and silverware, moved furniture into his flat in Fulham. She lost weight. Her voice lightened. For once, she wasn't enduring. She was living. That winter, she brought him to Mustique, carefully, separately. She was still trying to protect the myth, but they spent 3 weeks together in the sun, whispering at the beach bar. He wore the Union Jack trunks. A silver stud glittered in one ear. Unlike Snowdon, he didn't need to prove anything. He just was. But back in London, Tony was already constructing an exit. Lucy Lindsay-Hogg, his production assistant. Margaret could hear him come and go, banging in the bathroom at night. I asked for a separation, she said later. He laughed in my face. Still, the funerals, the weddings, the anniversaries, they walked side by side, smiling like broken clockwork. Behind her smile, Margaret was falling in love for the last time. She thought, perhaps, if she moved gently enough, if she poured enough warmth into him, he wouldn't grow cold. Roddy adored her, but he was a reed in a hurricane. He'd never held the weight of a woman like her. A princess, a mother, a survivor of decades of scalding scrutiny. And Margaret, who had learned to bend men by force, now tried to love one who bent with the breeze. She telephoned, sent gifts, invited him everywhere. He had never endured a long love. And here she was, intense, famous, wounded, ferocious, loving him like someone who had been disappointed too many times. It was too much. On their anniversary at Glen, something cracked. One afternoon, mid-lunch, Roddy stood up. He went home, packed, withdrew money, phoned his mother, phoned Margaret, told them he was leaving indefinitely. He flew to Guernsey, then London, then Istanbul. He took buses through Turkey, searching for something without shape. The sex had become a problem, he said. If I didn't get away, I'd break into 1,000 pieces. Back in London, Margaret shattered. Snowdon stalked the halls like a ghost who slammed doors. Roddy was gone, and her strength finally buckled. She overdosed. Engagements were canceled. The palace issued a lie, a severe cold. But the press whispered of pills. The Queen was colder. When a friend phoned Her Majesty, terrified Margaret might jump from her window, the Queen replied flatly, "Carry on with your house party. Her bedroom is on the ground floor." Roddy returned, eventually, disheveled, shaken. He entered a hospital. She wrote, called, waited. When he joined a commune at Surrendell Farm, gardening, living off the land, Margaret visited, pearls glinting among the compost and tiles. She tried to fit, to belong. She brought her heart where it would not be broken again. The Queen called it my sister's guttersnipe life. But Margaret didn't care. Not then. She had almost drowned. And Roddy, for all his fragility, had made her want to live. Then came the photograph, slightly blurred, taken from a beach in Mystique. Margaret in a bikini, laughing. Roddy beside her, bronzed, beautiful. 2 other guests were cropped out, but the image was enough. It looked like a scandal postcard. 45 and 28, princess and lover. No caption needed. It ran on every front page in Britain. Just like that, the performance ended. Tony moved out within days. Publicly, he was devastated. Privately, he was already living with Lucy. But now he had a photograph. A perfect excuse. Margaret returned from Mystique alone. She met with the Queen, with advisors, with decorum. A decision was made. There would be no divorce. Not yet, but it was over. That same day, Tony flew to Australia. On television, he performed Heartbreak. Margaret in England watched and said only, I have never seen such good acting. Still, she threw parties at Kensington Palace. Guests arrived drunk and left somehow ruined. You knocked. Someone opened the door. That was the only security. A lyricist once split his trousers stepping out of a car, and a lady-in-waiting stitched him back together by lamplight. People passed out in side rooms. Someone laughed, someone cursed, someone wept. Margaret didn't care. Noise was a kind of company. She adored Elton John. He sang Your Song at a charity gala and changed the lyrics for her, and she glowed, briefly, like someone remembered. At Lady Rothermere's ball, she seized the microphone and belted Cole Porter, her voice wobbling like a crown about to tip. Francis Bacon, blind, drunk, and wicked-tongued, booed from the back. Her singing was too awful, he said. Someone had to stop her. She fled. Her gown swayed behind her like a curtain falling on a play already in its final act. Mustique had once been her sanctuary, a place of perfumed nights and salt-stung mornings, but now it was the scene of a party that would not end. John Bindon bragged crudely about her. Roddy Llewellyn was hidden whenever the Queen arrived. He boarded small planes. She boarded Concorde. Even Paradise had protocols. Roddy snapped. I'm tired of hiding, he told a reporter. I just want to enjoy myself. Then came Barbados. Roddy collapsed. A rupture, a hemorrhage, a warning. Margaret flew to his side. The press caught the cruelest possible angle. Roddy upright in a hospital bed, Margaret poolside with dark glasses and a drink. One still image, one unforgiving frame. It was enough. The knives came out. Bishops condemned her. MPs demanded she resign. Give up Roddy or quit, screamed the tabloids. Her private life was handed to the public like scraps tossed to wolves. Roddy defended her. She's done nothing to shame the royal family. But the machine had already decided. May 10th, 1978. While Margaret lay in hospital recovering from hepatitis, the announcement came, their marriage should formally be ended. 17 words for 17 years. Tony said nothing to her directly. He had already moved out, already found Lucy Lindsay Hogg, already stepped into the soft, clean light of public sympathy. And still he performed. The trembling voice, the televised sorrow, the love and respect professed for the royal family. Margaret collapsed next. This time on the royal yacht. Tuvalu, 105 degrees. She shivered under the sun, a princess reduced to breath and fever. They flew her to Sydney. She refused the stretcher, walking down the steps with a scarf around her face and pride around her bones. I'm fine, she said. She wasn't. She fought back the only way she knew, through beauty. January 1980, jawline surgery. Not a facelift, she insisted. She lost weight, cut cigarettes, wore yellow and pink and soft waves in her hair. For a moment, she glittered again. Crowds roared at the Queen Mother's 80th. In Canada, she shimmered in fin de siècle silk, but shadows cling closer than silk. She's being treated like something special, one editor sneered. She's not. Roddy still came. Quietly. He picked flowers, lost at gin rummy, held her shaking hands. On her 50th birthday, she begged the Queen to let him attend dinner. No. Only the dance. They waited until the Queen left, then danced as though they had borrowed time. Behind closed doors, they still sang, still laughed, still held hands. He was still her darling angel. Then came the party she avoided. Roddy turned 33. She sensed trouble and stayed home. That night he met someone else, Tanya Soskin, younger, luminous, new. On Mystique, he told her. He was in love. She gave her blessing with a practiced smile. I'm very happy for him, she told a friend. I couldn't have afforded him much longer. She returned to the palace, closed the door, lit a cigarette. I'm back where I started with Peter, she said. But this time, I'm divorced. Then came Diana, a bride in ivory silk lifted by trumpets and innocence. Margaret watched from the royal box, face composed, as the world chose its new obsession. She felt the spotlight lift off her shoulders like a cloak being tugged away. They called her the Princess Diana of her day. The cruelty was in the tense. Then came Princess Michael, tall, blonde, Austrian, ambitious. At Ascot, Margaret answered questions in grunts. Later, she confronted the Queen. Why did you put me next to that woman? Because it let you do what you love most. Stare at the two handsome men opposite. Laughter returned, brittle, barbed. She mocked Princess Michael with poems at parties, relishing the bite. But beneath the wit was a quieter truth. The scandals weren't sticking anymore. She was no longer feared, no longer dangerous, no longer the story. Then, in the soft summer of 1992, a ghost returned. Peter Townsend. He was 77. She was 61. 34 years had thinned the thread, but not severed it. She invited him to Kensington Palace, but not alone. She needed witnesses, or protection from herself. They lunched, they drank, they spoke lightly. They did not speak of the life they lost. They sat side by side like echoes of a younger world. 3 years later, he died. She was saddened, the palace said. But grief has its own timing. In 1994, her old love letters to Robin Douglas home resurfaced, raw, breathless, fragrant with youth. Love me as I love you. New-mown grass and lilies. The public devoured them. They waited for outrage, for denial, for the royal wrath that once shook walls. She said nothing. Silence was all she had left to give. And for once they pitied her, not with scorn but with recognition. Here was a woman who had loved foolishly, fiercely, fatally. A woman still searching for her own story. Then, the true fall. Mustique, 1998. A stroke. One moment steady, the next not. She walked onto the plane unaided. She walked off changed. She tired easily, forgot meals. Her hand trembled when she lit a cigarette. Then came the bath, her son's villa, 1999. She stepped in to test the shower. A wrong tap, a rush of boiling water. Her circulation was so poor, she didn't feel the burn until it had already claimed her. She screamed, no one heard. She was flown to London. Her feet never healed properly. Soon, a cane, then a wheelchair. Then the slow surrender of shoes, heels to flats, straps to Velcro. Margaret, who once danced in diamonds until dawn, now measured her steps like someone walking through memory. And yet, she appeared. At Prince Edward's wedding, regal in her wheelchair. At the Queen Mother's 100th, she walked just barely as if daring the world to look away. At her 70th, she retreated to Balmoral, then returned to host a luminous, fragile party at the Ritz. But glitter dims. By Christmas 2000, she missed church. The Queen Mother, 100, injured, unbreakable, attended. Margaret did not. Another stroke, then another. Her appetite faded. Her speech blurred. Her face turned soft at one corner, as if grief had finally taken root there. She's fine, the palace insisted. She wasn't. In early 2001, a stroke took her arm, her leg, her voice. That voice that once sliced open rooms. She stared through gatherings that once depended on her. She refused therapy, took painkillers, let herself be wheeled, silent, through places that once sparkled because she entered them. And then, quietly, she slipped away. She died just before dawn on February 9th, 2002. At 6:30 a.m., in a private room at King Edward VII Hospital, her body gave way. Quietly, without spectacle. She was 71 years old. Her children, David and Sarah, were beside her. The Queen, with great sadness, has asked for the following announcement to be made immediately. So began the palace's statement. Her sister, the monarch, had been informed throughout the night. Margaret had suffered another stroke the day before. In the dark early hours, her heart had begun to fail. By the time she was moved from Kensington Palace to the hospital, her body was already letting go. There were no final words, no farewell. Just the slow unmaking of a woman who had lived on her own terms for too long to leave dramatically. The Queen Mother, frail but still alive, received the news at Clarence House. She is deeply saddened, her office said. 49 days later, the Queen Mother too was gone. Margaret was cremated, the first senior royal to choose fire over earth in modern memory. Her ashes were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside the father she had adored. She had once lit palaces with her laughter. Now she left them in silence. For a moment, the world looked back. They remembered the scandals, the lovers, the sharp tongue, the sad eyes. The woman who had once held the monarchy in suspense, who had refused again and again to become what they wanted her to be. Some called her a disappointment, but others, quietly, fiercely, called her something else. Real. She had loved badly and too much. She had lived loudly and without apology. She had ruined things. She had resisted things. She had burned. She chose loyalty over love. And when the flame finally went out, the world felt the cold. She had been many things, but from the moment she became the spare, she had been one thing most of all: Margaret, all alone. Thank you for watching this week's video on Princess Margaret. What are your thoughts on her? Do you feel she sacrificed love for duty, or was she denied the chance to choose? How do you think the press shaped her public persona? Was she treated fairly, or was she simply an easy target in an unforgiving world? Do you see her as a rebel trapped in a gilded cage, or as a woman who carved her own path despite the weight of expectation? And tell me, which moment in her life stayed with you the most? Her early love for Peter Townsend, her turbulent marriage to Tony, or the loneliness and longing of her later years? Let me know in the comments who you'd like to see us cover next. As a growing channel devoted to women's biographies, your support truly matters. Here, we tell stories beyond the scandals, stories of the myth makers, the rule breakers, the women who shattered barriers and were sometimes shattered by the world in return. Not the 10-minute summaries, not the neat, simplified versions, but the real lives, the full lives. The lives history tried to neaten, shorten, or forget. If you're here, you're part of something larger. A community that believes women's stories deserve depth, dignity, and the whole truth. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe that too. And a shout out to this week's trivia winners: Hobbit Ma, Cindy Russell 7017, Liesel.1373, April Grant, and Miss Pseudonyms. I'm not sure who was first, and if I missed you, shout at me in the comments. I will fix it next week. And remember to check the channel page every Wednesday for the next trivia question. And thank you to our members and patrons, the mythic men and women who make all of this possible. Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafam Chung, Deborah Himes, Bavia, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Deborah Shepard, Jules Mack, Kimberly Ray, Monica, Krista Schaefer-Hazlitt, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Kathleen Martin, Kelly Bowen, Melissa Gilmore, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Deb Fisher, Indira Betcha, Nikayla Rayana, Sarah Blyberg Stanton, and Snowball. Additional thanks to Joanne Thomas Yacato, Janet Phelps, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Karen Craig, Murphy's Bed, Lynn Sharp, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Mikkel Dean Augustine, Wendy Fairful, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Ram, Fiona McDougall, Julie Ann Scoverin, Sashi, Amy Johnson, Patricia Ahmad, and Kathy Harris. Morgan Rose, Moore Ross, Mary Margaret Cronin, The Moon is Blue Tonight, Julia Sierra Sanchez, MPB Angola, Deborah Eaton Kent, Rebecca Christians, Melu Marsa, Catherine Wolfe, Virginia Fraser, Cindy Morton, Elle Stadler, Libby Armstrong, Albert Norman LeBeouf, Julie Woith, Abby Henriksen, Susan Gillen, Hello Kitty, J.K., Charles Rosenbaum, Joanne Coleman, Maria Swisher, Michelle Gross, Trisha Commons, Lori Weckbaugh, Miriam Danielle, Sally, Tillery Sims, Cynthia Nagley, Judy Triplett, Shauna Nelson, Jody Bertolucci, Devin Hughes, Tiffany Bristow, Caribbean, Leanne, Jody Mamenga, Tracy Wilson, Ashley Kane, Sarah Herbert, Donay Crossley, Natcher Grell, Colleen Fay, Ann Casillas, Cynthia Mace, and Mina. Newest members: Nika Loving, Jenny Foster, Claire Zimmerman, Gianna Bloomer, Nicole Ramsey, Jennifer Phillips, Julianne D., Peter Kaukonen, Jacqueline Spalding, Crystal Wilhite, Virginia Martinez, TJ Sia, Zigzag, Michelle Owen, MM, Marcelina Martin, Beth Dawson, AP, Amber Perry, Shanna Supreme, P. Gallegos, Deborah Britton Offer, Catherine Rotensky Harrison, Vicky Russell, Coralie Reed, Lindsay Zeller, A. Terhar, Jean, Tanya Maza, Anne-Marie Walker, Generic 99, Nida S., Judith Barnett, Andrea Blackburn, Cheryl Kincaid, Laura Frankstone, Rebecca Salmon, Kathleen Veronese, Black Knight 5897, Mary Jane Moore, Three French Hens, Paula Coons, Susan Sinadin, Mark Fowler, Paul Fleischer, Patricia Culwell, and Liz Briskin. If I missed your name, leave a comment below and I'll make sure to put you at the top next week. And finally, thank you again for every watch, comment, like, and share. To the silent men and women who simply stay until the last note fades, thank you too. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history. And as always, thank you for watching Mythic Women.